Welcome back, everyone. This is your host, the DN WhatIf, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today we're diving into movie of What If Deku Became UA High's Guardian Ghost? A special shout out to the original creator, armadillos_digging_holes, for their incredible story, Ghost in the Halls. Please make sure to show your support by checking out their work. If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now let's get started with the fanfic. Midoriya Izuku was dead. He remembers how he died, of course. He had jumped off of the roof All Might had left him on, the words Kabakugu had used still fresh in his mind. Turns out he did have a quirk. He had emerged? He thinks that's the right word. From his corpse, now a ghost. His form wasn't mangled. He was perfectly intact as a ghost could be anyway. He thought it was a quirk because he had yet to meet any other ghosts. Through the months he had experimented and gotten better with it. He could still be heard by the living, but he couldn't be seen unless he wanted to be, and he rarely did. He could interact with things too. It had taken some practice, but he could interact with the world around him all he wanted. Anyways, enough about how he had gotten here. Let's talk about the present. Izuku was currently standing, floating, in front of the gates to UA. Entrance exams had been 2 weeks ago and it was the first day of school, though it was 5 a.m. so no students were there yet. Izuku was contemplating going inside. UA had been his dream school since he was young, but he wasn't a student and he had a death certificate. He had never worked up the courage to go back to his mom. He knew she would be overjoyed to have him back, but he also knew that she would just become more protective and that she would ask questions, and he couldn't handle that right now. Izuku held his breath and barged through the gate. He tensed, expecting some sort of alarm to go off, but it didn't. He let out the breath he was holding and did a little celebratory dance. It had worked. Once he was done celebrating, he looked around. What now? Well, Bakugo was supposed to be in the hero course, right? He was most likely in 1A with how powerful he was, so that's where Izuku went. It took him a while, but he eventually found the right room. He went inside, the same way he'd gotten through the gate, and stood at the back in the corner by the window. He waited there until the first student showed up. It was Bakugo. Of course it was. He had always been the first to arrive in middle school, so why wouldn't he be the first to arrive now? Though he did look different, more tired and a little less aggressive. Had his death affected him that much? No, it couldn't be, he reasoned. He had told him to jump after all. After Bakugo, a blue-haired boy arrived. He wore square glasses and had engines in his legs. Izuku immediately recognized him as a member of the Lita family. So cool. The boy tried to introduce himself to Bakugo, but he was turned away. At least Izuku knew his name now, and he had been right, the boy was part of the Lita family. Eventually the rest of the class trickled in. Izuku recognized Todoroki Shuto, Endeavor's youngest son, though he didn't really look like he wanted to be there, which Izuku thought was a little odd. While everyone was talking and introducing themselves, the door swung open, though no one seemed to notice. The only reason Izuku had was because he was facing the door. A man in what appeared to be a yellow sleeping bag lay in the doorway. He stayed silent a moment before standing. If you're here to make friends, get out. Everyone jumped and rushed to their seats. As the man introduced himself, Izuku had a mini freak out. It was Pro Hero Eraserhead. He was one of Izuku's favorite heroes. He was one of Izuku's favorites because he mostly fought quirkless. Once Izuku was done with his internal freak out, he realized that the class seemed frozen as they were rushing for the uniforms, like they were looking around for something, or someone. Izuku quickly realized it was him that they were trying to locate. He'd been muttering again. Eraserhead spoke up. It was probably nothing, now get to the field. That set the students off again, and they rushed to the uniforms laid out on the teacher's desk, each grabbing one before rushing out the door to the changing rooms. Once they were all gone, Eraserhead took one last look around the classroom before following his class, closing the door behind himself. Izuku sighed in relief. What now? If he wanted to stay, he would have to stay quiet. Should he follow the class? Eraserhead had said something about a quirk assessment test, and he really wanted to see the class's quirks in action, but he would probably start muttering again. Izuku sagged. He resolved to follow the class, but to keep his distance. He would also cover his mouth with his hand to try and muffle the noise if he made any. Yeah, he'd be fine. The students' quirks were so cool. One of them could secrete acid and another could use electricity. Though they didn't seem to have very good control over it, he would have to find a way to help them. One of the coolest quirks, in Izuku's opinion, was the one belonging to the tired-looking purple-haired boy. It looked like a brainwashing quirk that was voice-activated. Izuku could think of a multitude of ways it could be used for hero work. It would be so useful. But a few members of the class didn't seem to like it much. They started to try their best to avoid the boy after the first time he used his quirk. Izuku thought that the ones who were avoiding the boy were being very mean. No one deserved to be treated like that. Izuku would know he'd been treated in a similar way, and look where he was now. Izuku sighed and continued to watch the test. He hoped that Eraserhead would do something about it. He hadn't. Throughout the entire test, he hadn't said a word beyond reading out scores. Izuku still held out hope though. Maybe he'd bring it up at the end. But Izuku had also noticed a small grape-haired boy staring at the girls and making inappropriate comments, yet nothing had been done about him either. Maybe he'd be expelled. Eraserhead had mentioned expelling the person who came in last, but Izuku thought that what the boy was doing would elicit suspension at least. The test was finished and the class was gathered to look at their scores. Izuku hadn't caught anyone's attention the entire time, which he considered to be an accomplishment. Eraserhead pressed a button on his phone and a hologram lit up with the scores. At the bottom was the perverted boy's name. The boy promptly burst into tears. He started screaming about it not being fair and that the boy with the villainous quirk should be expelled, not me. He could never make it as a hero, he said while pointing at the tired boy. The boy who he pointed at promptly lowered his head and balled his hands into fists. Izuku was angry. Eraserhead had yet to interrupt, and though he looked like he was about to, Izuku decided he was taking too long. He pushed the purple boy over, watching him fall to the ground. It was then that Eraserhead spoke up. As I said, whoever scored last would be expelled. I also don't tolerate discrimination like that in my classroom, so even if you didn't score last you would have been expelled. Now get up, go change and go to the principal's office. The boy obliged, though begrudgingly, and made his way over to the change rooms. The ones who had been avoiding the boy with the brainwashing quirk had stiffened after Eraserhead mentioned discrimination, and Eraserhead seemed to be glaring at them. That goes for the rest of you as well? He raved his eyes over the class. I will not tolerate discrimination in my class. If I find out you were bullying another student for any reason, you will be expelled, understood? The class nodded and Eraserhead nodded stiffly in return. Go change and grab a syllabus from the stack in the classroom. Regular classes will resume tomorrow. The class hurried off, but Izuku stayed behind. He had a decision to make. Should he keep coming back? Should he just leave? He didn't know. He might as well return. He reasoned. He hadn't really seen all that the members of Class 1A could do, plus he wanted to check out all the other classes as well, including the Gen Ed, Support and Business courses. He decided he would come back tomorrow at the same time, except this time he would explore a little before class. Izuku nodded to himself, affirming his plan as he left UA grounds. He didn't really know what he would be doing with the rest of his day, but he didn't really want to snoop around just yet. The teachers were still planning for the first day after all. Maybe he'd snoop next time. Izuku was once again outside the UA gates at 5 a.m. This time he rushed through the gates immediately, though he did pause once he was through to make sure no alarms went off. Instead of going to the 1A classroom, he wandered the halls. Eventually he found the staff room and phased through the door. Inside he found an array of desks and a few doors heading off to other rooms. Some of the desks had photos, memorabilia or other decoration, while others were barer. On the left wall in the corner, there was a counter and a fridge with some cupboards hung above them. Embedded in the counter was a sink and there was a coffee pot in the corner. Izuku wandered over to the cupboards and opened them. In one there was some instant coffee and some tea, while the other held an array of different mugs. Some were plain while others had different designs. Some said things like #1teacher or best teacher in the world, and some had different designs. There were 3 cat-themed mugs and a few that were space-themed. One had a cockatoo on the front, and a few had different quotes from a variety of novels. Under the cupboards there were more mugs on hooks. One had a black cat with red eyes on it. Izuku was pretty sure he knew who the cat mugs belonged to now. There were a few more #1teacher type mugs, but there was one mug in particular that caught Izuku's attention. It was orange and had "Have a great day" written on it in white text, but what had grabbed Izuku's attention was the fact that there was something printed on the bottom. He picked up the mug and flipped it over. On the bottom was a hand holding up its middle finger. Izuku's eyes widened marginally and he put the mug back. Why would a teacher have a mug like that in school? Izuku was pretty sure it was Eraserhead's. The man seemed like the type to not like his colleagues. Once Izuku was done investigating the mugs, he moved on to the desks. He felt a little bad snooping around the teachers' desks, but he wanted to know a little bit more about them. The first desk he came across had a neat stack of paperwork, a closed laptop, and a picture of Vlad King posed with a golden retriever. Izuku thought that made sense. Vlad seemed like a dog person. In the drawers, Izuku found some miscellaneous papers and supplies. Nothing very interesting. The next desk Izuku investigated was about the same. It was Snipe's desk, obvious by the gun Izuku found in one of the drawers, though that was the only interesting thing. The next desk seemed to be 13's. They had a few pictures of the constellations on their desk and a photo of 2 ferrets. In the drawers, Izuku found more papers and supplies and some space-themed stickers. He took a few for himself. He skipped a desk that he had deduced to be ectoplasms, as it looked rather boring. The only marginally interesting thing was a photo of him surrounded by his clones. The next desk he investigated was power loaders. He knew this because there was a picture of him with a former class on the desk. In the drawers he found some support course-related forms and some basic tools. He skipped over Midnight's desk, a little scared as to what may be inside, and went to a desk that was obviously present Mix. On the desk was a photo of high school-age present Mike with what looked to be a teenage Eraserhead and a blue-haired boy with a bandage on his nose that Izuku didn't know. There was also a photo of Mike and Eraserhead together that looked more recent. Izuku picked up the photo to inspect it further and saw 2 matching rings on their hands. Izuku carefully put the photo back in its place and smiled to himself. He was happy for them and they seemed like a good couple. He moved on to the drawers and found what he had found in just about every desk so far, paper and supplies. He sighed and moved on to the second-to-last desk. This desk was obviously Eraserhead's. It was right next to Present Mix and had a used cat mug on it. How many cat-themed mugs did this man own? He had the same photo with the blue-haired boy as present Mike sitting on his desk as well as a small stack of paperwork. In the corner of the desk, there was a photo of Mike covered asleep on the couch with 5 cats covering his person. In the drawers, Izuku found more supplies and more forms. Nothing very interesting yet again, so Izuku moved on to the next desk. The moment Izuku looked at the desk he froze. On the desk, in a pristine frame, was a photo of All Might during his time in America posed with his old sidekick Dave. This desk belonged to All Might. Since when was he a teacher? Wasn't his time limit 3 hours? It was then that Izuku heard footsteps headed for the teacher's lounge. He looks at the clock, 6 a.m. Shit. Izuku looks around in a panic, forgetting that he can't be seen. Looking up he spots a vent cover on the back wall. He floats up to in and phases in just as the door is opening. He looks out of the slits of the vent cover and watches as the teachers trickle in. First is Ectoplasm, who is engaged in conversation with Snipe. Next is Midnight with Power Loader following a few minutes later carrying some forms. 13 comes in around 4 minutes later converging with the others at the coffee machine. Semitas comes in after 13 with a book in his hand. He goes over to his desk and begins to read. The last to arrive are present Mike and Eraserhead, who arrive together about 30 minutes after Ectoplasm and Snipe. Eraserhead has a cup of coffee in his hand and is holding hands with Mike, who seems to be talking to him about how excited he is to meet 1A. Mike drags Eraser over to where the rest of the teachers, minus Cementos, are talking. Izuku decides to move on to someplace else and continues down the vent shaft until he finds another cover. Through the slits, Izuku sees Principal Nedzu, who seems to be doing paperwork and working on something on his computer that Izuku can't see. He phases out of the vents and floats over to Nedzu, settling just behind his shoulder. On the computer is a long string of code that Izuku can't really understand. In the top left corner of the screen, it says UA Security System. So Izuku assumes that Nedzu is either updating the system or making sure everything is running smoothly. Izuku watches Nedzu do paperwork and type away at the computer for a few minutes before one of the pencils falls off the desk. Nedzu is about to reach for it, but Izuku stoops to get in first and holds it out to the principal, whose eyes widen in surprise. Izuku quickly realizes his mistake. He hasn't revealed himself to the principal and he isn't supposed to be there. He sets the pencil on the desk and quickly runs to the other end of the room, phasing through the door. Izuku runs down the hall and takes a few turns down corridors he doesn't really recognize. Eventually he comes to a stop in front of the 1B classroom. He poked his head through the door and saw quite a few of the students already inside. He checked the clock on the back wall. Classes would be starting soon. Izuku pulled the rest of his body through the door and settled into the back right corner. He wondered who the 1B teacher was? Nedzu stared at the pencil left on his desk as he thought. The alarms hadn't gone off, but this had obviously been an intruder. Yes, there was an invisible girl in Class 1A this year, but she couldn't phase through walls and his door had neither opened nor closed. There was a student who could phase through walls, but he was a third year and couldn't go invisible. He checked the time. Classes would be starting in less than 5 minutes, so there was no time for a staff meeting and the intruder didn't seem to be hostile. He elected to up the security measures and hold a meeting after school. He turned back to his computer, simultaneously writing an email and editing the security. Izuku waits in his corner, observing the students in the classroom. At the front of the room, a blonde boy with blue eyes was talking with a girl with orange hair and a boy with a head that reminded Izuku of a thimble. A boy with jet black skin and stark white hair was talking with a boy with a bug-shaped head and a girl with a puffy brown bob, the bangs covering her eyes. A boy with silver hair and peach-colored frills around his eyes was talking loudly with a boy with spiked black hair, a bandana wrapped around his head. The rest of the class seemed to be having a discussion of their own, centered around a large boy with glasses and a beard who seemed to have started the conversation. Out of all of them, Izuku was most focused on the conversation the blonde boy was having. He was saying something about how 1B was clearly better than 1A. Izuku was interested in this conversation because the two classes had yet to interact and yet this boy still had such a strong opinion. Izuku glanced at the clock, 3 minutes until class would start. He floated over to the blonde boys group so he could hear their conversation better. The ginger girl was currently speaking. Understand how you have such a strong opinion. We haven't even talked to 1A yet, how do you already know who's better? Exactly what Izuku had been thinking. I just do okay? I mean, it's rather obvious since we're all in 1B and we're better. The ginger girl rolled her eyes while the boy with the thimble-shaped head looked contemplative, well, as contemplative as he could look. The door opened just before the bell rang. In the doorway was Vlad King. Izuku had to physically stop himself from mumbling. Instead, he flapped his hands to stim and let his excited energy out. Was Vlad King. He faced some discrimination because lots of people considered his quirk villainous. Izuku didn't think that though, no quirk was inherently villainous just like no quirk was inherently heroic. Izuku had said that to Katsuki once when they were young, but he had just been yelled at and exploded, so he never brought it up again. The students had all gone to their desks, waiting for Vlad to start talking. Izuku rushed back to his corner. Alright class, first things first, today you'll be picking a class president. It's fully up to you how you decide, just make sure you do it before the end of homeroom. The class immediately started talking over each other. The only silent ones were the jet black boy and Izuku. The ginger girl, Izuku really needed to learn their names, stood. We need to think of a fair way to do this. How about everyone gets into a circle and we'll go around stating our names and our causes and then we'll hold a vote. Everyone agreed to her plan, so the class pushed their desks to the side and gathered in a circle. Izuku floated into the middle of their circle. He had to pass through the blonde boy to get there and he had shivered as he passed through before glancing around. Izuku had to hold back an apology, he didn't want to reveal himself yet. The first person to go was the ginger-haired girl. Hello everyone. My name is Kendo Atsuka. If I'm made class president, I promise to maintain a positive image for our class and keep everything running smoothly. The next to go was a boy who didn't look like he had any lips. My name is Hananuki Juzo. If I'm made president, I will keep everyone in line and make sure everything gets done. Next was the silver-haired boy. From what Izuku had observed, he was like a Kirishima double. My name's Tetsu, and if I'm made president, I'll make sure everyone stays fit and happy. He was very loud, but Izuku liked his spirit. Next was a girl with vines for hair. Hello everyone. My name is Shiozaki Ibara. If I am elected as president, I will keep things calm and make sure we stay on the good side of the Lord. After he was the boy with black spiky hair. My name is Owaze Yosetsu. If I'm elected president, I'll make sure everyone has fun. After him was the blonde boy. I'm Minoma Nito. If I'm elected president, I'll make we stay better than 1A and that we maintain UA's good reputation. The class seemed a little exasperated with Minoma, but Izuku liked him. He was confident and had a set goal. He was a little rude, but he was better than Bakugo. Next was a short white-haired boy. My name is Shota Narangaki. If I am elected as president, I will make sure our test scores stay high and maintain our reputation to the best of my ability. After him was the boy with the thimble-shaped head. My name is Bondo Kojiro. I don't really want to be president, so I ask that you don't elect me. The rest of the class nodded so that he knew they understood, and they moved on to the next person. My name is Tsuburaba Kozai. I don't really want to be president either. The class gave their agreements once again before moving on. The next girl, Kodai Yui, didn't want to be president either, so they skipped to the next one in line. My name is Rin Hiryu. If I'm elected, I'll keep everyone in line and help with whatever problems you may have. Next was a girl with blonde hair and large horns on her head. My name is Tsunatori Pony. If I'm elected as president, I'll keep everyone in line and make sure happy is everyone. Izuku thought that her Japanese was really good, but it was apparent she wasn't from Japan originally. The next girl to go had a shy demeanor and also didn't want to be president. She introduced herself as Yanagi Reiko. After her was the boy with a beard. Hello everyone. My name is Shishida Jirota. If you elect me as president, I pledge to keep everything in order and keep everyone fit. After him was a plain-looking boy with flat black hair. My name is Kaibara Senator. If I'm elected as president, I will do my duties responsibly to the best of my ability. The next three to go were the jet black boy, the girl with the puffy bob, and the boy with the bug-shaped head and pincers. None of the three really wanted to be president, but they introduced themselves as Kurwaro Shirhai, Komori Kinoko, and Kamakiri Tagaru respectively. Next to go was a girl with shoulder-length green hair. "Hi. My name is Tokage Setsuna. If I'm elected president, I'll make everyone tough and maintain an awesome reputation." Last to go was a boy with a manga page for a head. "My name is Fukidashi Manga. I don't think I'd be a good president and I don't really want to be one." With that, the introductions were over. The class put their desks back where they were and Kendo passed out some slips of paper for people to write their votes on. She also placed a top hat, where she got it nobody knew, on the teacher's desk, instructing them to place their slip in the hat when they were done. It only took around 5 minutes for everyone to cast their vote and put it in the hat. Kendo wrote everyone's name on the board and counted the votes everyone got using tallies next to their name. By the end, Kendo had 9 votes and Shishida had 7. This made Kendo president and Shishida vice president. Izuku was very happy for them. He thought that they were perfect for the job. Especially Kendo. He wondered who 1A elected? Personally, he thought that Ida and Yoiorozu would be perfect for the job. After the class presidents were selected and everyone was back in their seats, the bell rang signaling the start of the first class of the day. Just a moment after the bell rang, Present Mike burst through the door. "Good morning, little listeners. Who's ready for their first English lesson?" No one replied to him, but he didn't seem fazed. "Today we'll just be reviewing some of the basic things to see what you all know. Near the end, I'll hand out some diagnostic sheets. Does that sound good to everyone?" This time he got a few tentative replies. "Alrighty then, let's get started." Izuku stayed for a little while, but about a quarter way through class he got bored. He already knew everything that Present Mike was saying, and since he wasn't a student he could just leave, right? He wasn't really supposed to be there anyway, so he decided the best course of action would be to leave. Wandering the halls was pretty boring too. He knew he should probably sit in on a class, education was important after all, but he couldn't really get a job anymore. Well, he could, but that would mean revealing himself, and he still wasn't ready for the onslaught of questions and panic that would cause. Oh, and he was also technically breaking the law by being on UA grounds, though he didn't think he'd be there much longer. He had revealed himself to Nedzu after all, and he was the smartest being in Japan, possibly the world. Izuku continued to wander the halls until he saw a flash of yellow in one of the vents. He stopped below the vent, trying to see what was inside. From what he could work out, there was a giant yellow caterpillar in the vent. He floated up so he was eye level with the vent. Now that he got a good look at it, it looked like there was an opening at the top with hair sticking out and a zipper going down the middle. Was there a hobo in the vents? No, they wouldn't have been able to get on school grounds. So who was in the vent? It would have to be a teacher, since it couldn't be a student. Classes were still in session. Izuku phased into the wall space above the vent. Once he was fully in the wall space, which felt a little odd since it was solid, he stuck his head out into the vent space. He was now face to face with Eraserhead. He knew Eraser couldn't see him, but he was still startled. Once Izuku had calmed down, he took a better look at Eraserhead. His eyes were closed and he looked less stressed than he had been when Izuku had seen him the other day. It took a moment for Izuku to figure out he was asleep. But why would he sleep in the vents? It didn't seem like it would be comfortable. Izuku pulled his head back into the wall and floated forward a little until he was sure he would be somewhere in front of Eraserhead. Once he was sure, he phased his entire body into the vent. He had to crouch down so he could fit, and now that he thought about it, UA's vents were bigger than normal vents. Crawled forward and turned a corner. What he saw were 4 different shafts, supposedly leading to different places in the building. Did UA have an entire network of vents? So why? Well, Izuku reasoned there was only one way to find out. So he got into a more comfortable position and picked a vent shaft to follow. Izuku had been exploring the vents for a while, charting them out in his mind. A few of the shafts he had found just led to dead ends, sort of like a maze. Currently, he was in a vent overlooking the cafeteria. Specifically, it was right above a table occupied by 1A students. The reason he had stationed himself above this table specifically was because they were talking about the fact that they had heroics training after lunch and were speculating about who the teacher would be. Izuku already knew who it was though. Why else would All Might be at UA? Though now the only thing Izuku could think about was whether he should attend the class or continue to explore the school. In order to decide, he made a mental list of the pros and cons. Pros: he would get to further analyze Class 1 as quirks, he would get to see what hero training is like, and he would get to see the class hero costumes. Cons: he would have to see All Might. After a while of consideration, he decided to go to the class. He would get to analyze, plus he could mess with All Might a little. He knew it was mean to think that way, but also All Might had shattered his dreams. He couldn't really hold it against the man he had been, right after all. but he thought he at least deserved to have a little fun. Izuku was waiting in Class 1's classroom for the bell signaling the start of heroics to ring. The rest of the class was already gathered since lunch had recently ended. Izuku was in his corner nervously glancing between the door, the clock and the bell. It only took another moment for the bell to ring and All Might to burst through the door. "I am here." The moment those words left his mouth, the class was in hysterics. Everyone was freaking out about All Might being their teacher. Everyone except Todoroki, that is. As Izuku was surveying the room, trying not to pay too much attention to All Might when he noticed Todoroki sitting in his seat stoically. Todoroki was one of the few whose names he knew. He knew Todoroki because he was Endeavor's son. Izuku had noticed a few concerning things about Todoroki during his time with 1A, leading him to contemplate following the boy home. Maybe he'd do so tonight. Not like he had much to do. All Might said something about hero costumes and the wall slid out, revealing 20 numbered cases. Everyone rushed forward to grab their case and left the classroom in order to get to the training field All Might had specified. Izuku followed along at a more leisurely pace, keeping a few steps behind. When the class got to the change rooms, Izuku waited outside so he could follow the first student to where they were supposed to wait. Unsurprisingly, the first student out was Todoroki, so Izuku followed a step behind him to where All Might was waiting. Izuku stood beside Todoroki until the rest of the class came out and he had to move to the back of the class. He didn't want to risk someone standing inside of him as that was uncomfortable for both parties involved. He would know it happened frequently when he first became a ghost. Once the class was gathered, All Might pulled out a small stack of cue cards and began reading from them. "Today we will be doing battle simulations. Everyone will be assigned to either the hero or the villain team. Each team will have 2 members and teams of 2 will go up against each other. In order for the villain team to win, they must either incapacitate the heroes or protect the bomb until the timer goes off. The heroes win by either capturing both villains or recovering the bomb. Each team will have 5 minutes to prepare and each round will last 20 minutes. Now everyone come up and pull a letter from this box to determine your teams." Izuku thought that the lesson plan was a little stupid. No one in the class, except maybe a few people, were trained in hand-to-hand or quirk control beyond the basics, plus they had never even used their costumes or support equipment before today. What if something went wrong? Izuku watched as each student pulled out a ball with a letter on it and found their teammate. There was an uneven number of students since Mineta had been expelled yesterday, so the teams were as follows. Shinso and Uraraka Team A heroes. Shoji and Todoroki Team B heroes. Bakugo and Ida Team C villains. Oyama and Ishido Team D heroes. Sato and Koda Team E villains. Kaminari and Jiro Team F heroes. Tokoyami, Azui, Kalmitsu Ribbit, and Yoioroza Team G heroes. Ojiro and Hagakure Team H villains. Kirishima and Siro Team I villains. All Might announced each name and team after everyone had found their teammates, so Izuku now knew all their names. After everyone had found their team, they drew lots again to find out who they would be up against. Shinso and Uraraka heroes versus Bakugo and Ida villains. Shoji and Todoroki heroes versus Ojiro and Hagakure villains. Tokoyami, Tsu, and Yoiorozu heroes versus Kirishima and Siro villains. Kaminari and Jiro heroes versus Bakugo and Ida villains. Aoyama and Ishido heroes versus Sato and Koda villains. Since there was an uneven number of teams, Bakugo volunteered to go a second time. Once the teams were selected, the first 2 left to start planning. The first teams to go against each other were Shoji and Todoroki as heroes and Ojiro and Hagakure as villains. When the teams got to their building, they were given 5 minutes to plan. The villain team, Ojiro and Hagakure, talked with one another and put together a plan in the time given. Shoji tried to talk to Todoroki but was shut down and didn't try again. Once the 5 minutes were up, Shoji tried to walk into the building but Todoroki held out an arm to stop him. Todoroki walked up to the building and put his right hand against the wall. The building was immediately encased in ice. On the cameras, Izuku could see both Hagakure and Ojiro trapped in the ice. All Might called the match the hero team victorious. All Might looked pleased but Izuku was upset. The lesson didn't seem to be well thought out, but the intentions were clear. This was supposed to be a teamwork exercise and All Might had said that he wanted to get a gauge on their abilities. He wasn't able to see anything of what Shoji, Hagakure, or Ojiro could do, and Todoroki had barely even shown his own abilities. Speaking of, didn't Todoroki also have a fire aspect to his quirk? Why didn't he use it? This exercise would have been good practice. Todoroki entered the building a few moments after All Might called the match and was melting the ice encasing Ojiro and Hagakure. When the 2 were free, all 4 came back to the observation room together. All Might stepped forward and turned so he could face both the returning team and the rest of the class. "All right, students. Who can tell me who the MVP was of that round? Yorozu slowly raised her hand. Yes, young Yorozu? I believe the MVPs are Ojiro and Hagakure. They came up with what appeared to be a well-thought-out plan and were ready to execute it. All Might looked confused and slightly displeased. Actually, I believe that Todoroki is the MVP. He took out the villains quickly and efficiently. Yorozu looked a little disappointed but also confident. I see where you're coming from, sir, but he completely neglected the point of the exercise. This was supposed to show how we work with others as well as where we are with our fighting and planning abilities, right? While Ojiro and Hagakure filled 2 of these quotas, but Todoroki completely ignored his partner and barely showed off his own abilities. Furthermore, the drastic change of temperature his ice caused could have set the bomb off if this were a real situation. Todoroki looked annoyed and All Might looked shocked a moment before he quickly gathered himself, clearing his throat. Yes, I see your point, young Yorozu. You're right. Now then, let's move on to our next teams. Aoyama, Ashido, Sato, and Koda rejoined the class and the next teams left the room to go to their building. The next teams out were Aoyama and Ashido as heroes against Sato and Koda as villains. From what Izuku had observed, Koda wasn't very talkative and preferred to communicate using sign. Judging from Sato's reaction to Koda trying to communicate, he didn't know anything about the language, but Sato pulled out a pad of paper and a pencil, so that problem was quickly solved. Aoyama and Ashido were talking while looking over the supplied building layout. After the 5 minutes were up, Aoyama and Ashido entered the building. When the 2 hero students entered the building together, a swarm of squirrels, birds, and insects swarmed them. There wasn't any audio, but it looked like Aoyama was screaming and Ashido was trying to calm him down. They rushed out of the building, followed by all of the animals. The swarm kept the 2 away from the building until the 20 minutes were up, ending in a victory for the villains. All Might announced the victory with slightly less enthusiasm than he had before. Izuku didn't know if this was because he was disappointed in how easy it was for the 2 to win or if he was upset because the team playing the villains won. The 4 returned to the observation building together. Sato and Koda looked sheepish and slightly apologetic, Aoyama looked indignant, and Ashido looked annoyed. Sato was apologizing to Aoyama as they entered the room. All Might talked to them first this time, obviously not wanting to be embarrassed like he had the first time. Good work, but Sato, Koda, your plan wasn't very well thought out and easily could have failed. You shouldn't rely on the animals like that. Izuku thought that was a little hypocritical. Koda had those animals swarm the 2 using his quirk, and All Might was reliant on his quirk in all of his fights. Sato winced when All Might was done chastising them and brought his hand up, rubbing the back of his head. Actually, sir, that was only the first part of the plan. We didn't expect it to work as well as it did. Koda nodded along as Sato spoke. All Might's eyes widened slightly and he paused before he spoke. I see, very well then. He turned towards the rest of the class and once again asked who the class thought the MVP was. Yorozu answered again, stating that it was Sato and Koda. Izuku was starting to get anxious. He wanted to write down his analysis so badly, but he couldn't. He didn't want to interrupt the class and he didn't want to be kicked out. Once Yorozu was done, the 2 returning teams returned to their seats and the next team left. Next up were Kaminari and Jiro as the heroes against Bakugo and Ida as villains. Bakugo and Ida would be going second time against Shinso and Uraraka since there was an uneven number of students. The 4 made their way to the building. Izuku was watching Bakugo closely. He was curious as to how it would go. From what he remembered, Bakugo was arrogant and hard, if not impossible, to work with, but it had been 10 months, so there was a chance he had changed. Sure enough, when Ida tried to talk to Bakugo, he looked close to interrupting him but didn't, instead listening to his ideas and occasionally adding his own. Izuku continued watching them, intrigued. He wished he had access to the audio so he could hear what they were talking about. When the time was up, Bakugo stalked off down the hall while Ida stood guard over the bomb. Kaminari went around to the back of the building and walked up to the power generator while Jiro crept inside the building, occasionally sticking her jacks into the walls. Kaminari placed both of his hands on the generator and electricity surrounded him, yellow sparks flying everywhere like lightning until it surged into the generator. The generator exploded in a cloud of smoke, fire, and sparks. When the smoke cleared, Kaminari stood where he had been before. His hair was blown back and he was covered in soot and ash. He had his thumbs up and looked out of it, like he had fried his brain. Or short-circuited. All Might didn't do anything about it. He didn't pause the exercise or call for medical bots. All he did was watch. Izuku watched the screens a moment longer. Kaminari was starting to wander around and Izuku didn't want him to get hurt, so he memorized where he was on the cameras and sped towards the door. He could watch Bakugo's next fight. When he got to Kaminari, the boy had wandered over to the alley adjacent to the building his template was currently fighting in. Izuku grabbed his sleeve and started guiding him to the city exit so they could go see Recovery Girl. When they reached the entrance to the fake city, the bus was waiting at the gate, doors open. From what Izuku remembered, the bus was self-driving. He led Kaminari onto the bus and sat him in one of the seats at the front. He floated up to the control panel. There were a set of buttons on a screen, each of them labeled for different cities, gyms and other buildings. Each button had a secondary button that gave information about each destination. Izuku pressed the button for the main school building since it was where Recovery Girl was. The bus's doors closed and it started towards the building. As the bus drove, Izuku explored the other panels while keeping an eye on Kaminari to make sure he didn't leave his seat. On a secondary panel, there were buttons that allowed you to call different staff members or robots to meet you when you arrived. Izuku pressed the button for the medical bots and floated over to Kaminari. He sat beside the boy and spent the rest of the ride thinking. When they arrived at the building, there were two med bots waiting, holding a stretcher between themselves. The bus came to a stop and the doors opened. Izuku grabbed Kaminari's wrist and guided the boy out of the bus to the stretcher. Kaminari laid down on the stretcher and the bots made their way into the building. Izuku followed them to make sure Kaminari got to the infirmary safely. Once he saw the boy put on a bed and Recovery Girl come over to check him over, Izuku went back to the bus and took it back to the city. When he got back, Bakugu's first round was over and the next battles had just begun. He wasn't there when Bakugu won, but he could assume by the triumphant smile he wore that it had been his team. The next teams were Tokoyami, Tsu, and Yoiarozu as the heroes against Kirishima and Shiro as the villains. The match had already started when Izuku got back. Shiro was in the bomb room, which was covered in a web of tape. Kirishima was patrolling the 10th floor, where they had planted the bomb, waiting for the hero team. Tokoyami, Tsu and Yoiarozu were each searching different floors. Yoiarozu was 2 floors below the bomb floor working her way up. Tsu was on the middle floor working her way down, and Tokoyami was on the 2nd floor working his way up. Around 10 minutes later, Yoiarozu made her way to the 10th floor. Yoiarozu was turning a corner when she came face to face with Kirishima. She tried to turn on her comms so she could tell the rest of her team, but Kirishima began attacking before she could. He punched her in the stomach, and while she was doubled over, he took some tape from his pocket and secured her arms to her torso. Once she was sufficiently restrained, he dragged her over to the bomb room. Shiro helped him get her situated in the back left corner of the room, and Kirishima left to continue patrolling the floor. Tokoyami made his way to the 10th floor only 2 minutes later. He saw Kirishima before Kirishima saw him. Tokoyami used his comm to tell Tsu what floor he was on before Kirishima spotted him. Kirishima tried to use the same attack he had used on Yoiarozu, but Dark Shadow blocked it. Tokoyami made his way behind Kirishima while Dark Shadow kept him occupied in front. When he had made it behind the other boy, he kicked him in the back. Kirishima fumbled forward and Dark Shadow pushed him, resulting in Kirishima face planting. Tokoyami used the capture tape to bind Kirishima's hands, making sure the boy was okay as he leaned him against the wall. All Might's voice burst from the speaker. Kirishima has been captured. Tokoyami nodded slightly to himself and rushed down the hall to where he assumed the bomb room was. Tokoyami peeked into the room. Upon seeing the mess of tape, creating something resembling a spider's web, he elected to wait for Tsu. Said girl arrived a minute later, sticking to the wall above Tokoyami. After the two made eye contact, Tsu moved along the wall so she was above the door. She peeked her head down so she could see into the room. Shiro was hanging on a length of tape in the back left corner like a spider. He was crouched above Yoiarozu, who sat tied up below him. Tsu made eye contact with Shiro, the boy sending a burst of tape at her head. Tsu ducked back up and looked over at Tokoyami. Tokoyami nodded to her and the girl jumped off the wall to join him on the ground. Dark Shadow burst into the room before them and started tearing through the tape. Shiro kept sending streams of tape at the creature, trying to capture it, but Dark Shadow just tore through the strips. Tokoyami kept behind Dark Shadow, helping the entity maneuver to keep Tsu hidden. The aforementioned girl was making her way to Yoiarozu in order to untie her. Once Tsu had reached Yoiarozu, she got to work untying the girl. It took her about 2 minutes, and by then Shiro had caught on to their plan. Shiro sent a mess of tape at Tokoyami and Dark Shadow, preoccupying the shadow, and swung behind the bird boy. Once he was in range, Shiro sent a stream of tape towards the two girls, binding the two together. Unlucky for him though, Yoiarozu had had time to make a knife. Tokoyami and Dark Shadow spun around, Dark Shadow having finished with the tape and brought Shiro back into a fight. Yoiarozu cut through the tape and she and Tsu snuck up behind Shiro. Tsu bound the boy in her tongue, pulling him down to the ground. Yoiarozu took the capture tape from her belt and bound the boy's hands together. Once the tape was secure, All Might's voice rang out from over the intercoms. Zero has been captured. Hero team wins. Please come back up to the observation room. Yorozu cut the tape off of Zero and the four left to go retrieve Kirishima before heading back. When the four entered the observation room, All Might once again asked the class who they thought the MVP was. Bakugo raised his hand to answer. Yes, young Bakugo. Bakugo lowered his hand. The MVP is Ponytail. She had her team positioned so that they would search the rooms thoroughly and had ideas for if one of the extras got captured. Soy Sauce's idea was pretty good too. All Might nodded. Wonderful job, young Bakugo, I agree. The two teams rejoined the class and the last teams left for their match. They used a different building than any of the other teams since one was still melting and the other was full of tape. The next teams were Shinso and Uraraka as the hero team and Bakugo and Ida having their second go-around of being the villain team. When the planning period was up, Shinso was floated onto the roof by Uraraka, who entered through the front door. Shinso had a mechanical mask on over his mouth and nose. It had knobs on the sides and looked like a voice modulator. Izuku elected to look into it later. Around 2 minutes into the match, Shinso and Bakugo met on the 9th floor where the bomb was. Bakugo started with a right hook. Shinso dodged and used the explosive boy's stumble as an opportunity to kick his legs out from underneath him. Bakugo face-planted, but before Shinso could capture him using the capture tape, he used his explosions to propel himself upright. Bakugo sent an explosion at Shinso's face, the boy barely dodging in time. Shinso ran down the hall glancing into different rooms looking for the one with the bomb. He turned on his comm and told Uraraka what floor he was on as he ran, waiting for confirmation before turning it off again. Bakugo was gaining quickly, explosions propelling him forward occasionally. After a few moments, Shinso finally spotted the bomb room, turning sharply to the left to get inside. Ida, who was standing in front of the bomb, jumped when Shinso entered the room. Bakugo stormed in after Shinso and Uraraka burst in after him, having seen the two enter the room when she arrived on the floor. Bakugo engaged Shinso in a fight after Uraraka entered, paying no mind to the other two in the room. Uraraka took a moment to look around the room to see if there was anything she could use her quirk on, but the room was empty except for the bomb and the current occupants. Ida cackled, "So you've noticed that I cleared the room, hero? Now there are no opportunities for you to use your quirk and more for me to use mine." Uraraka had spotted a door in the back right corner during Ida's speech. It seemed to be bulging slightly, like there was more stuff inside than it could hold. When Ida finished his speech, he ran at Uraraka with his quirk activated, initiating a fight. Shinso dodged blast after blast, not having enough time to send out attacks of his own or adjust the knobs of his mask. Eventually there was a small lull in the relentless attacks. Bakugo looked to be resisting the urge to rub at his wrists. Shinso took the opportunity to punch Bakugo in the stomach. Bakugo folded over and Shinso adjusted the knobs of his mask. Bakugo quickly got back up, lifting his fists and aiming a punch at Shinso. The aforementioned boy dodged the punch, darting to the side. "Bakugo!" Ida called. Bakugo didn't pause his attacks as he answered, "What foe?" Bakugo suddenly went limp, eyes clouding over. Shinso wrapped the still boy in the capture tape and All Might's voice came over the intercoms. Bakugo had been captured. Ida startled at the sound of his own voice. He hadn't spoken, so where had it come from? His momentary confusion gave Uraraka time to use her quirk on him. He floated up to the ceiling, flailing. Uraraka darted forward and touched the bomb. The bomb had been recovered. Hero's victory. Uraraka smiled and released her quirk. Ida fell to the ground but quickly bounced back up. "That was an excellent battle. Though I must ask where my voice came from? It was not me speaking." Shinso, who was untying Bakugo, still under the effects of his quirk to avoid being exploded, raised his hand. "That would have been me," he said in Ida's voice. He raised a hand to his mask and took it off his face. "It's a support device since my quirk doesn't work through normal speakers or recordings." Ida nodded and moved to help him untie Bakugo. Once they had untied the boy, the four returned to the observation room. And with that, the battle trials ended. Now that the battle trials were over, so was the school day. Izuku was waiting outside of the change rooms for Todoroki to come out. He had noticed that the boy was incredibly reserved and the fact that he refused to use his fire worried him. When the boy came out, Izuku followed closely behind him. They ended up walking all the way to the Todoroki manor. It wasn't very far from UA, maybe around 3 blocks away. When Todoroki reached the door, he took a deep breath before turning the knob. Izuku followed him inside before the door closed. "I'm home." As soon as the sentence left the boy's mouth, Izuku could hear Endeavor's voice. "Esichoiro oh." Todoroki sighed. Endeavor came around the corner and stopped in front of his son. He had flames in the shape of a beard framing his face, and there were small wisps of flame at his shoulders. I heard that idiot All Might is your heroics teacher. Is this true? Todoroki seemed to stiffen before nodding. Endeavor scoffed, there's no way that imbecile is a good teacher. In fact, I'm sure he'll undo all I've taught you. Go change and go to the training room. I'll be waiting. With that, Endeavor stormed off. Todoroki toed off his shoes and slipped on the slippers waiting by the door before going down the same hall as his father. He stopped at a room a little way down and opened the door. From what Izuku could tell, it was the boy's bedroom, so he waited outside until he emerged. When Todoroki came out of his room, he had changed into a white t-shirt and shorts. He started walking down the hall again and Izuku followed. He made a turn and walked down to a double door at the end of the hall. He opened one of the doors and slipped in, closing it behind himself. Izuku had to phase through the door to get inside. Endeavor started yelling at Todoroki for a few moments before he started attacking the boy. Todoroki was able to dodge for a while, sending up glaciers to block a few of the hits he couldn't dodge. After a while, frost started spreading across Todoroki's right side. He also started to slow down. Endeavor took this as a chance to punch the boy in the stomach. Todoroki buckled over and looked like he was trying not to throw up. Izuku rushed over and crouched beside Todoroki. Endeavor was yelling now, something about Todoroki being foolish and weak, but Izuku had tuned it out. Todoroki was shivering and shaking and looked seconds away from collapsing. Endeavor stopped yelling and Izuku looked up at the man. He had flames going down his arm to his hand and he looked like he was reaching for Todoroki. Time seemed to slow as Izuku stared at those flames. Endeavor was going to burn his own son. Izuku was enraged. Some of the exercise equipment in the room began to float, swirling around the room. Endeavor looked around, confused. His arm was frozen halfway to Todoroki. The equipment spun faster and faster. In the mess, Izuku saw quite a few metal dumbbells. The heaviest was 100 pounds, indicated by the 100 engraved on both sides. Izuku sent the dumbbell at Endeavor's head, but it missed, hitting the man in the chest instead. Endeavor stumbled back and fell on his back. At this point, Todoroki had noticed the floating exercise equipment and was watching in bewilderment. Izuku piled a few more heavy objects on Endeavor and picked up Todoroki bridal style. The boy seemed surprised but let it happen. Izuku crashed one of the treadmills through the doors, turning them to splinters. He left the room and started wandering the halls. I have a first aid kit in my room, Todoroki spoke up from his arms. Despite knowing the boy couldn't see him, Izuku nodded and headed for the boy's room. When he got to the door, he paused a moment. Todoroki reached over and pulled it open. Izuku went inside and placed the boy on a futon in the corner. He went back to the door and closed it. He looked around the room but couldn't see the first aid kit. It's on the shelf in my closet. Izuku glanced over at Todoroki, who was leaning his back against the wall with his legs sprawled out in front of himself. The boy still had frost coating his right side and was panting slightly. Izuku went over to the closet and opened the door. He saw the first aid kit immediately and picked it up. After a moment, he grabs an extra blanket as well. Izuku goes back over to Todoroki and wraps the blanket around him, looking him over for injuries. There's a large bruise on his stomach, but luckily that's the most major injury. There are a few more minor scrapes and bruises that are easily dealt with. When Izuku is done, he puts the medkit away. He sits down beside Todoroki, who stopped shivering, and they sit in silence for a few minutes. Todoroki sits up a little straighter. Thank you. Izuku smiles and pats Todoroki's shoulder. He shivers a little and they go back to sitting in comfortable silence. After a few minutes, there's a knock on Todoroki's door. Shudo? It's Fuyumi. Can I come in? Todoroki calls her in and the door opens slowly. Fuyumi steps into the room and closes the door behind herself. She looks Todoroki over. Did you already deal with the injuries? Todoroki glances in Izuku's direction before nodding. Fuyumi sighs. All right. Do you know why Dad is stuck in the training room with equipment stacked on top of him? Or why the doors were shattered with a treadmill? A ghost? Todoroki says, completely deadpan. Fuyumi startles a bit, obviously not expecting that answer. A ghost? Todoroki nods. Father punched me in the stomach and I felt something appear at my side. He was about to burn me when the equipment started floating everywhere. 100-pound weight hit him in the chest and knocked him over, and some more equipment was stacked on top of him. I was picked up before one of the floating treadmills smashed through the training room doors. I told the ghost to bring me to my room and they dressed my wounds. Fuyumi sighed. Alrighty then. Can I meet this ghost? Todoroki looked over at Izuku, or at least where he assumed Izuku was, expectantly. Izuku stood from his place on the floor and walked over to the closet. The door was still open and there were a few more blankets stacked on the shelf. Izuku grabbed one and threw it onto Fuyumi. It landed on her head and draped over her shoulders like a sheet ghost costume without the eye holes. Fuyumi reached her hand up and pulled off the blanket. Her hair was a little messed up and she tried to pat it down. Izuku felt a little guilty, so he went into the bathroom attached to the bedroom and found a hairbrush. He brought it back and handed it to Fuyumi with his head down, though she couldn't see it. Fuyumi sighed and took it, brushing out her hair. "Thank you," she said once she finished. Izuku took back the brush and put it away. Fuyumi sighed. "Okay, I guess we have a ghost now." "Say, ghost, where did you come from?" Izuku bit the inside of his cheek. He knew that if he spoke they would hear him, but he didn't know if he wanted them to know. They might rat him out for being on UA property and he didn't want to get in trouble. After a moment he sighed and started speaking. "Well, I died around 10 months ago and it had always been my dream to attend UA, so I snuck in by phasing through the gates. I've been hanging out around UA the past few days and I noticed Todoroki showing the signs of abuse, so I followed him here. Also, I'm about 98% sure that being a ghost is my quirk, since I haven't met or seen any others and I only activated it after I died." He took a deep breath and looked at the other two in the room. Fuyumi looked surprised and Todoroki looked blank-faced like always, but when Izuku looked a little closer he noticed that his lips were downturned slightly. Fuyumi looked in Izuku's general direction before speaking. "Okay then. You seem like you're about Shudo's age, so you can stay here if you want, but if that's going to happen you have to promise me something." Izuku nodded, but after realizing she couldn't see him he voiced his agreement. Fuyumi nodded. "You have to do your best to protect Shudo from Endeavor." Izuku agreed quickly. He had been planning on doing that anyway. Fuyumi nodded to herself and left the room after telling Shudo that she was going to start on dinner. Izuku and Shudo talked until dinner was called. Endeavor wasn't there since he was still trapped in the training room, and Izuku promised to free the man in the morning. Izuku and Shudo continued to talk in the latter boy's room until late into the night, at which point Izuku told Shudo he needed to sleep. Izuku waited until he was sure Shudo was asleep to continue snooping around the house. He phased through the bedroom door and started wandering down the hall. There were no other rooms along the hall other than the training room, where Endeavor was still trapped, so Izuku moved on. He left the hall and immediately came across the kitchen and dining room. The kitchen was rather large. The dining room was attached to the kitchen, separated by a sliding door. Izuku looked around the rooms for a minute, but after not finding anything of interest he moved on. On the other side of the house are 4 bedrooms, an office and another door. Izuku pokes his head into each of the bedrooms. One of them has a double bed and is obviously Endeavor's, so he phases all the way through the door and starts investigating. There was a bed in the center of the room. It had space for 2 to sleep, but only one side looked used. There was a wooden wardrobe in the bottom left corner and a desk in the top right with an old desk chair tucked into it. Izuku floated over to the desk, on top of which was a closed laptop, a light on the side indicating it was in sleep mode instead of being powered off. Izuku took a deep breath and made himself solid, something he hadn't done properly in months, usually only for a few minutes at a time and always in a setting where he felt safe and calm, like when he would watch the sunrise or sunset from a roof. He was getting sidetracked, so he shook his head to try and clear his thought and sat down in the desk chair, opening the laptop. It felt weird to suddenly have gravity affect him, to be able to interact with things outside of floating them, especially in a place where he found no comfort. He shivered and tried to focus his attention on the laptop screen. He tried to push the feeling of being solid from his mind, but oh god, this also meant people could see him. What if Fuyumi or Shudo came into the room? What if Endeavor somehow freed himself and came storming in? Izuku's hands started shaking and he accidentally pressed a few of the buttons on the keyboard. He snapped his hands back and tucked them against his chest, the shaking spreading to the rest of his body. He felt hot and his breaths became ragged as he started panicking. He tried to focus on his breathing, tried to get his breaths to even out. His eyes scanned the desk trying to find something to help. There was a cup of pencils on the desk and inside the cup was a pencil grip. It was at the bottom of the cup and was clearly rather old. The blue shade of the rubber was faded and there was some dust on it, but Izuku reached for it anyway. His feet were balanced on the legs of the chair and both were shaking more aggressively than the rest of his body, so he took them off, resting his feet on the floor between them. His fingers wrapped around the pencil grip and he started squeezing it. He tried to focus on the feeling of it in his palm, how it was just barely big enough to squeeze even if it wasn't completely comfortable, the feeling of the rubber against his skin, the feeling of the indents where fingers were supposed to rest. He closed his eyes and leaned his head back against the back of the chair. Eventually he could feel his body calm down. The shaking died down, though it didn't stop, and his breathing was starting to calm. It was now he realized that tears had gathered in his eyes and were starting to spill. He kept his eyes closed and moved his focus from the grip in his hand to his breathing. He took deep breaths and followed one of the breathing patterns he remembered reading about in middle school. It took a few more minutes, but eventually, he was calm enough to go back to investigating, snooping. He kept the grip in his left hand and used his right to use the laptop. He tapped a few keys to get the screen to light up only for it to show a lock screen. Izuku threw his head back and groaned. He looked around the room to see if he could find anything that would hint at the password. His quick survey of the room yielded nothing, so he started opening drawers. The first one he opened was in the top right of the desk, and the first thing that Izuku saw was a yellow sticky note that read, "Password. Defeat industrial might." Izuku typed it into the text box, and sure enough, the computer opened up to show a tab open to Endeavor's bank account. There was another tab in the bar that looked like it led to files for Endeavor's agency, but Izuku reasoned he could go one at a time. Izuku looked through Endeavor's bank information and copied down all his different card numbers onto a sheet of lined paper he had taken from a notepad using a pen he had taken from the cup. He made sure to put the paper in an obvious place so he could find it when he left. Before he moved on to the agency files, he fished around the drawers a little more to find an unused USB. Eventually he found one. It was a basic black USB and it didn't have anything on it yet, so it would do nicely. Izuku clicked over to the next tab and started going through the files. There was a bunch of stuff about collateral damage costs for both buildings and people. Izuku immediately started digging deeper, finding everything he could and copying it to the USB. There were thousands of files about money sent to businesses for destroyed buildings and even more sent to families for killed or injured relatives due to Endeavor's incompetence, though there was never a word that was used. Izuku was going to be sick. He quickly copied all of it to the USB and moved on. The next thing Izuku looked at was Endeavor's email. There were a few things about meetings and paperwork, but what caught Izuku's eye was an email from a month ago. Or should he say an email and the reply that went along with it. An employee from his legal department had asked him to try and control his fire more to avoid injuring civilians and burning down buildings, as it was getting harder and more tedious to cover up, and people were asking for more and more money as compensation. Endeavor had apparently not liked hearing this and had told the employee that they were fired in his reply. He had also said that the now former employee should warn the rest of the department that if they tried to pull something similar that they would be fired as well. Izuku saved a copy of the transaction to the USB and continued searching. The next thing he came across was Endeavor's personal files. There was so much damning evidence that it was laughable. He had files filled with recordings of him beating his children and his wife the few times she tried to step in, but there was one video in particular that really had Izuku fighting not to throw up everywhere. Endeavor was yelling at a boy who was curled up on the floor. His hair was stark white and he was covered in burns. There were small blue flames sparking around him and he was shaking uncontrollably. He didn't look like he could be any older than 14. From what Izuku could see of the boy's face, he was steadily growing angrier until eventually, he burst into flames. Endeavor stumbled back as the room was enveloped in blue flames that seemed to reach out for him. Izuku, despite wanting to look away, continued to watch the screen. He paid special attention to the shadows, and though it was hard to see, he could make out the boy slowly standing as Endeavor fled. The boy staggered to where the windows were and looked to slowly pull himself out before his shadow disappeared and Izuku could no longer see him. Izuku scoured old files to see if he could find security camera footage of the boy, but all other footage of the day had been erased. Izuku copied the footage he had to the USB and closed the laptop. He grabbed the paper containing the bank information and the USB before walking over to the door, turning the knob and stepping out. He snuck quietly through the house since he was still solid and could therefore be seen and make noise, making his way back to Shido's room. When he got there, he pushed the paper and USB under the door before taking a deep breath, letting go of the feeling of solidity. He did a little spin, letting himself feel light again, and phased through the bedroom door. It felt good to be back to being transparent and floaty. He was more than used to it at this point. It had become a sort of comfort. He floated the paper and USB and let them set down on Shido's desk. He looked at the clock on the desk. The sun would be rising soon. Izuku phased through the wall to the outside of the house and floated up to the roof. He liked watching the sunrise. It was calming. Sometimes he would be solid for it, sitting on the edge of the roof and swinging his legs, but that was few and far between, plus he had spent enough time being solid today. He floated just above the edge of the house and watched as the sky slowly faded into oranges, yellows, pinks and blues. He watched until the sun had taken its first position for the day, at which point he went back inside, ready to escort Shido to school. First day of school. The school day had just ended and the staff was all gathered in meeting room C instead of prepping to go home. Netsu had sent an email earlier in the day informing them all of the new meeting he had scheduled, though he hadn't stated why it was being held. Once everyone was settled in their seats, Nezu pressed one of the many buttons on the dashboard in front of him and a screen fell from the ceiling. He pressed another button and a video started playing. It was obviously taken from one of the many security cameras in the principal's office. In the shot, Nezu was filling out paperwork while simultaneously typing on his computer. This continued until a pencil fell off the desk. The chimera reached to grab it, but before he could, something else grabbed it. The pencil seemed to freeze midair for a moment until it was placed on the desk quickly. Nezu stared at the pencil for a moment and the clip ended. Immediately there was an uproar of noise in the room, everyone trying to talk over the others but all with the same question: who had managed to get into UA completely undetected? Nezu quickly called for silence and waited for all of them to be seated before continuing. I agree that this is an issue, but they have yet to show themselves to be hostile and I don't believe they are on UA grounds at the moment. I wanted to ask if anyone else has had odd experiences today. Aizawa sat up. I have. All eyes turned to the perpetually tired man. While they were rushing to the front in order to grab their gym uniforms, it sounded like someone was mumbling. The students had frozen and were trying to locate who it was, but it stopped after that. I got them out to the field and nothing else like that happened again. Nezu nodded. Anyone else? No one had anything else to add, so they moved on. They talked about how they were going to up the security measures and how they would prepare for the next school day. Present. Izuku waited patiently outside of Shido's door until the boy emerged and followed him to the dining room. There was a plate of bacon and eggs set in front of one of the chairs with a note folded next to it. Shido sat in the chair and unfolded the note. Izuku looked over his shoulder so he could read it. I know that this isn't what you would normally have for breakfast, but I thought you deserved something special today since I couldn't make anything for your first day. Plus Dad can't really complain right now, can he? Zoxo. Fuyumi love. P.S. Please remind your friend to let Dad out of the training room. He has work today. Izuku saw the slight upturn of Shido's lips as he ate, the note sitting open in front of him. When Shido was done eating, Izuku left to free Endeavor from his confines. When he got to the training room, Endeavor was trying in vain to remove the training equipment from his chest. Izuku rolled his eyes and sent all of the equipment back to its original spot. Immediately Endeavor stood and started whipping his head around, presumably looking for Izuku. Of course he couldn't see the boy, so he seemed to move on quickly. The man stormed out of the room and Izuku followed closely behind him. Eventually the man stopped at the door to the bathroom, throwing it open before slamming it closed behind himself. Izuku shrugged and left the man to his business, going to find Shido. He found the dual-haired boy at the front door putting on his shoes. Izuku floated over to the backpack by the door and rifled through to make sure everything was packed. While he was looking through, he found a book with a sticky note attached. For Ghost. Sorry I don't know your name. This is for you. I thought that it would probably be a little boring for you at UA. Thank you again for agreeing to watch Shido. Zoxo. Fuyumi. Izuku smiled and zipped up the bag. He handed it to Shido and the two left for UA. When they arrived in the classroom, they were the first ones there. They were an hour early, so that was to be expected. Shido sat down in his seat and hung his bag off the hook on the side of his desk. Izuku unzipped the bag and pulled out the book. He removed the sticky note and placed it on Shido's desk. The boy seemed to read it over before pulling out his phone and opening HeroTube. The boy pulled out a pair of headphones and plugged them in. Izuku floated over to the corner by Shido's desk and opened his book. Around 30 minutes later, Izuku heard footsteps outside the door. He quickly grabbed the note off Shido's desk, using it as a bookmark before putting the book away in the backpack. The moment Izuku had finished zipping up the bag, the door opened and the blue-haired boy with glasses walked in. The boy started walking towards Shido and Izuku tapped the boy on the shoulder. Shido looked up and took out one of his headphones. Ida stopped in front of his desk. Good morning, Todoroki. How are you doing this fine morning? Good morning, Ida. I'm doing fine, how are you? Ida's smile brightened. I'm doing fine as well, thank you for asking. Ida turned and headed for his own desk, hanging his bag on the hook and pulling out a book. Shido put back in the earbud and unpaused his video. He had turned on subtitles, so Izuku watched over his shoulder until class began. When Aizawa entered the room, it took a minute for anyone to notice him, but when they did, all conversation ended and they were all rushing to their seats. Aizawa stood at the front of the room behind his podium. It took you 3 minutes to notice me. Better than yesterday, but still not good enough. We'll be going on a field trip today to the USJ for rescue training. You may choose whether you wear your hero costume or your gym uniform. You have 10 minutes to change. Meet at the front of the school for the bus. Aizawa left the room as the class rushed to grab their cases. Izuku followed Shido to the changing rooms, waiting outside for the boy to change. The class gathered in front of the bus as Ida tried to corral them into an orderly line, though that turned out to have been pointless since it was set up like a city bus instead of a school bus. Izuku floated above Shudo, who was sitting in the back of the bus. On beside him, on his right, was Jairu, sitting in front of them was Bakugu, and behind them was Shuji. Izuku watched the road flash by outside the window as he waited for them to arrive at the USJ. The chatter on the bus wasn't too loud. They were mainly talking about the USJ and what they would be doing there since no one knew what USJ stood for. Izuku is pretty sure he heard Kaminari say something about Universal Studios Japan. He was broken out of his train of thought when he heard Azui start talking to Shinso. I'm a rather blunt person, Shinso, so I always say what's on my mind. I was wondering what your quirk is. Izuku looked over to Shinso, who had stiffened in his seat across from Azui. He had the same look in his eye that Izuku remembered having. Like when he told them his quirk status, all of them would hate him. Like his quirk was a death sentence. Shinso took a deep breath and made eye contact with Azui as he answered her question. My quirk is brainwashing. If someone answers a question I ask them, I can take control of them for a bit. Shinso's answer confused Izuku. What the boy had explained was hypnosis, not brainwashing. Brainwashing was the process of pressuring a person into taking on radically different beliefs or opinions using systemic and often forcible means. Hypnosis was the induction of a state of consciousness in which someone loses the power of voluntary action and is highly responsive to suggestion or direction. Izuku's confusion quickly changed to anger. The boy had probably had an incompetent doctor or quirk analyst and had therefore ended up with an inaccurate view of his quirk. Izuku leaned down and whispered his observations in Shudo's ear so the boy could speak up for him as he wasn't comfortable talking directly in front of everyone. People had started whispering about Shinso's quirk and the boy was staring at the floor. When Izuku finished telling Shudo what he wanted him to say, the boy did as told. That's hypnosis, not brainwashing. Everyone turned to look at Shudo. Shinso seemed the most surprised, which made sense. Shudo was about to flip something that had defined the boy's world upside down. Brainwashing is the process of pressuring a person into taking on radically different beliefs or opinions using systemic and often forcible means. Hypnosis is the induction of a state of consciousness in which someone loses the power of voluntary action and is highly responsive to suggestion or direction. Therefore your quirk is hypnosis, not brainwashing. Shinso's eyes were so wide Izuku thought they might pop out of his head. He was staring at Shudo like the split-haired boy was the strangest thing to ever exist. The other students were looking at Shudo as well, though none of them looked as surprised as Shinso. Shudo had gone back to watching videos on his phone with his headphones and was ignoring everyone else, but Izuku was watching everyone's reactions carefully. There were those who didn't seem very fazed by the news and there were those who looked entirely surprised, though Izuku didn't know whether that was because of the information they had received or because it had been Shudo who said it, since that had been the most he had spoken in front of the class. Shinso looked the most surprised, of course, but the one who had caught Izuku's attention was Ajiru. He was looking warily at Shinso. Izuku had started floating over to the boy, though he didn't know what he was going to do when he got there. When the bus pulled to a stop, Aizawa stood from his seat at the front of the bus and turned to face the class. Off the bus. I'll come off last, so wait for me before going in. Everyone stood and started making their way out the door. Shudo paused to put away his phone and headphones before following. Izuku stayed above Shudo and ended up phasing through the bus to get out. Aizawa walked up to the front of the group, leading them inside the building where Pro Hero 13 was waiting. Shudo was standing next to Uraraka, so Izuku would have clearly heard her say, "Oh my god, it's 13, if he hadn't been paying attention to something else. Aizawa had pulled 13 off to the side and was holding up 3 fingers. Immediately Izuku was thrown back to his first time on his rooftop. He called it his because he had jumped from it, so he thinks deserves some ownership. All Might had deflated and was leaning up against the small railing blocking the edge of the roof. The railing didn't even come up to Izuku's waist and was obviously the result of a lazy builder doing the bare minimum so they could go home early, but that wasn't what Izuku was focusing on. What he was focusing on was the man sitting before him who looked seconds away from death with his shirt pulled up to reveal a scar spanning his entire left side, who was telling him, a 13-year-old he didn't know, a national secret. A secret that included the fact he could only work as a hero for 3 hours a day. So All Might was supposed to be at the USJ but had run out of time. He could easily use his small form to avoid recognition when commuting to UA to avoid fans and paparazzi, plus it would help him save time for class. Even if he was in his buff form on the way to UA, he should know to end civilian interactions quickly. Maybe he was involved in a few villain attacks? But there were never any big issues this early in the day and never so close to UA. At most maybe a small bank robbery, but there are hundreds of heroes who patrol close to UA who are more than capable of taking care of any incidents. All Might had no excuse to not be in class. Izuku's brow furrowed. Was All Might really this irresponsible? Yes. Izuku sighed and focused on 13. They and Aizawa had rejoined the class and 13 was giving a speech about how dangerous quirks can be. Izuku was looking around the plaza while the hero spoke when he spotted something in the center. A dot of purple mist was growing in front of the fountain. No one else seemed to have noticed since they were all giving their full attention to 13, so Izuku leaned down and poked Shudo in the shoulder. His finger phased through since he hadn't made himself solid, causing Shudo to shiver. He looked up in Izuku's direction before looking around the plaza. It was then that the boy spotted the mist in the center, which was now much bigger than it had been before and had people flowing out of it. Sir? Aizawa, who had been on his phone, looked up at Shudo. Yes, Todoroki? Is that supposed to be there? He pointed to the plaza center where there were now what seemed like hundreds of villains. Aizawa jumped up as 13 turned to see what Shudo was pointing to. Shit. Everyone stay back, those are real villains. Aizawa had his hands on his capture weapon as it floated around his head and his goggles were secured over his eyes. 13, you get the students out of here. It was then that he rushed down the stairs towards the swarm of villains. Izuku was about to go after him. His fighting style wasn't meant for big groups like this after all, when a man made of the same mist in the plaza appeared in front of the door. Greetings. We are the League of Villains. Bakugo and Kirishima rushed the villain as 13 was trying to use their quirk, but the two boys didn't get very far before they were swallowed by the villain's portals. Izuku was looking around urgently, trying to find a way he could help when his gaze landed on Ida, specifically the boys' engines. He would be able to get to UA and get them help. Izuku quickly explained his half-plan to Shudo. The boy nodded and rushed over to Ida, repeating what Izuku had told him. The boy refused at first, but it didn't take much to get him to agree. 13 had activated their quirk on the mist villain, and Ida used this as a distraction so he could run through the doors without issue. Just as he had exited the building and was rushing back down the road, the villain opened a portal and started using 13's quirk against them. The back of 13's suit ripped open and they fell to the floor. Whatever was inside their suit was being ripped into the portal. Izuku rushed the mist villain, phasing through and startling them enough that they turned off their portal. It didn't take long for them to recover, though, as was made apparent by the students falling through portals. Izuku watched as Shudo fell through one with Hagakure. He bolted to the portal, darting in just before it closed. Izuku fell through the portal, half of his body phasing into the ground. He quickly flew out of the floor and looked around, trying to find the two he had fallen through with. Shudo was on his left, starting to stand while rubbing the back of his head. On his right, Izuku could see Hagakure's gloves and boots sprawled on the ground. He made a mental note to try and get Shudo to talk to her about her costume or to take the time to leave her a note. He knew there was a third year with a costume made from their DNA for their quirk, and he was sure they could do the same for her. He floated over to Shudo and phased a hand through the boy's shoulders so he would know he was there. The boy looked up at him and nodded slightly to show that he understood. Izuku looked around to see if he could discern which section they were in. They were on a rocky slope, the center plaza barely visible over piles of rock at the bottom. They were in the landslide zone. Izuku was about to try and tell Shudo that Hagakure was there, certain that the boy hadn't noticed her, when two villains jumped out from behind nearby rock piles and rushed them. Shudo reached out his hand to try and freeze them, frost starting to spread from his foot. Izuku panicked and raced towards Hagakure, floating her into the air like he had done with the training equipment. The ground beneath him froze over, coated in a thick layer of ice. He slowly put Hagakure down so she wouldn't slip and turned to Shudo. He had his hand around a spear he had coated in ice. Attached to the spear was a villain frozen in ice. There was another villain on Shudo's other side, in the same predicament as the one with the spear. Shudo turned to the one on his right and started talking, though Izuku couldn't hear what he was saying. He floated over to the boy so he could hear the conversation and tell him about Hagakure. It turns out Shudo was trying to get answers out of the villain by threatening to leave him trapped in the ice until he died. Izuku floated up so he was hovering over Shudo's shoulder and waited for the boy to stop talking before leaning in to whisper in his ear, "Hagakure fell through with us. She's over to the right." Shudo paused his interrogation and turned his head to the right. Izuku watched him scan the area before he spotted Hagakure's gloves and boots. He called her over and Izuku watched the gloves and boots jump into the air slightly before landing back on the ice. Her feet slipped out from beneath her and her arms shot out to her sides as she tried to regain her balance. Izuku winced and urged Shudo to go over and help her. The boy did as told and walked over to her, grabbing her arm to steady her and bringing her back over to help with the interrogation. The two talked to and threatened the villains a little more until they got answers. Apparently they were here to try and kill All Might, and the two had been hired to try and kill any students in their zone. After unfreezing the villains just enough that they wouldn't die, their feet still trapped in ice, the three made their way down the slope. Shudo was at the front with Hagakure following closely behind him so he could unfreeze the ground and clear her a path. When they reached the bottom of the slope they were met with a horrific sight. Aizawa was pinned beneath a giant monster. Its skin was purple and stretched tightly over bulging muscle, looking like it would tear away under the pressure. It had a bright yellow beak instead of a mouth and its brain was exposed. It had Aizawa pinned underneath it, the man's head held tightly in its large fist. The man looked bloody and slightly out of it. There was a large crater in front of him making it clear that the monster had smashed his head into the ground at least once. His arms were bent at unnatural angles and Izuku could see bone peeking out from the arm trapped in the monster's grip. Behind the monster was a man covered in severed hands and the man made of mist. Both were watching the monster mutilate Aizawa. Izuku felt a mix of anger and fear rise in his chest. He burst forward towards the monster, phasing through Shudo in the process. He charged at the monster, not really knowing what he was going to do when he got there but charging in nonetheless. He got closer and closer until he was inches away from the monster. He expected to phase through and have to double back but instead he stopped inside the creature. Suddenly it felt like he was alive again, like he had a body all his own to control. He looked around and quickly realized he had possessed the monster. It made sense, he could do everything else your classic ghost could do, so of course he could possess things as well. It didn't make the situation any more unsettling. He quickly clambered off of Aizawa, gently setting down any limbs the monster had had in its grip. He turned in a circle, getting himself used to the body he now controlled. Once he had a feel for the body he turned to the man covered in hands. He was obviously the leader of this endeavor and would therefore have to be dealt with. The man was yelling something but Izuku didn't care to hear it. He just kept making his way over to the villain. As soon as Izuku was in range he wrapped one of his big fists around the villain's thin waist, lifting him into the air. The villain tried to bring his hands down on his arm, in a way that made Izuku assume he had some sort of powerful 5-point activation quirk, but he didn't get the chance. Izuku wound his arm back and threw the villain as far as he could. The man slammed into the back wall of the USJ and slid to the ground, leaving a small crater in the wall. The man slowly got to his feet, swaying slightly before he rushed back, arms outstretched. Izuku braced himself and just before the man reached him he grabbed both arms in his hand. He pulled his arm down, sending the man sprawling forward. He brought his other hand down on the man's back and pinned him down to the ground, copying the position the monster had used with Aizawa. He snapped one of the man's arms, taking a moment to listen to him scream before slamming his head into the ground. The crater he created was bigger than the one that had been in front of Aizawa and when he removed his hand the man didn't get up. Izuku panicked for a moment, guilt filling his stomach at the thought of having killed someone before he realized the man was still breathing. He let out a breath and stood, clambering off of the man. He started ambling towards the mist man but didn't make it very far before he folded in on himself and disappeared. Izuku looked back behind himself at where he had left the other villain but he was gone as well. Izuku nodded to himself and focused on himself. He didn't really know how he was supposed to leave. He took a moment to think before floating up, pretending he was already out. It worked and he ended up floating above the monster's head. He blinked and looked down at the monster. He thinks the pale-haired man had called it a Nomu. The monster was standing in place, unmoving. It didn't even look like it was blinking. Izuku shivered. He spotted the class up on the steps. All of them were staring down at the creature. Shudo and Hagakure were up there too. Aizawa lay between them. They must have retrieved the man when Izuku had been beating up the villain. Izuku started floating towards the steps but he didn't make it very far before the wall burst open, revealing All Might behind it calling out his familiar catchphrase, "I am here." Izuku floated between groups of students as they gave their statements to the officers who had arrived at the USJ. Aizawa had been taken to the hospital along with 13 but luckily no students were injured badly enough to constitute going to the hospital. Izuku had briefly considered going with the two teachers but had decided that he would be of better use staying with the students. He flitted between students to make sure everyone was okay until they were all done giving their statements and were being loaded onto a new bus to take them back to UA. Izuku continued to float around the bus, never staying in one place for too long. The bus ride was a stark contrast to the previous one. No one spoke and the atmosphere was sullen and quiet. It also seemed to last longer going back than coming in. When the bus finally arrived Izuku got off last, making sure all the students got off safely. They went to the changing rooms to change out of their hero outfits and into their school uniforms before making their way to the front gates. There were a few parents at the gates to pick up their kids. Those whose parents had come looked relieved while those whose hadn't didn't seem fazed much. Izuku was relieved not to see Endeavor in the gathering of parents, but this relief was short-lived when the two heard Endeavor scream, "Shuto!" as soon as they floated, through the door of the Todoroki estate. Izuku watched Shuto tense and moved in front of the boy. Endeavor came bursting from around the corner and immediately started monologuing about how Shuto surely did the most work during the USJ attack and how that was only to be expected since he was his son. On and on he went, without an end in sight. After 3 minutes of Endeavor's spieling, Izuku finally had enough. He phased through Endeavor, causing the man to pause his speech and shiver. He then phased back through the man and leaned in next to Shuto's ear, telling the boy to go to his room when he gave the signal. The boy gave a discreet nod. Endeavor went back to talking, but that didn't last long as shoes floated off the rack and started circling him. The man tried swatting at the shoes, but they just got closer and closer to him until you could no longer see him. Shuto quickly but carefully skirted around him and ran down the hall to his room. Izuku waited a few minutes before releasing the shoes, sending them crashing to the ground. Izuku ran straight through Endeavor down the hall and phased through the door to Shuto's room. The boy was already changed out of his school uniform and was sitting on his futon, scrolling through his phone. Izuku floated up behind him and looked over his shoulder so he could see the phone screen. Shuto was scrolling through a news site looking at all the reports on the USJ attack. How they had produced all these articles so quickly Izuku had no idea, but what he did know was that Shuto shouldn't be seeing the reports so soon after the attack. Izuku tugged at the edge of the blanket to get Shuto's attention. Once the boy was looking up from his phone, Izuku floated it out of his hands. The boy looked up and tried reaching for it, but to no avail. Izuku kept the phone out of his reach until he eventually gave up and sat back on his futon. Izuku kept the phone floating as he watched Shuto stare at him, where he thought he was a few centimeters off. The two continued to stare until Shuto finally spoke, "We should get to know each other." Izuku startled slightly and almost dropped the phone. He gathered himself and made sure the phone was still safe in the air before turning to the other boy. He made a good point. They were going to be spending a lot of time together, so it would make sense. Izuku nodded to himself and settles across from Shuto. "Okay." The other boy seemed a little surprised that he had agreed, but he didn't let it show for long. Shuto shuffled himself into a more comfortable position before asking the first question. "I don't actually know your name. What is it?" "Oh. Midoriya Itsuku." Izuku twisted his fingers in his lap, watching Shuto carefully. The other boy nodded. "All right, now it's your turn to ask a question." Izuku took a moment to think before hesitantly asking, "What's your favorite food?" It didn't take very long for Shuto to answer, "Cold soba." "What's yours?" Izuku didn't hesitate in saying, "Katsudon." The two continued like this for hours, going back and forth asking simple questions, like what their favorite colors were or their favorite animal. This continued until Fuyumi called them down for dinner. Izuku could tell that Shuto was uncomfortable, sitting across from his father at the table. Fuyumi was on the left, eating her food like nothing was wrong, though she occasionally glanced between the other two. The dinner was going well, no one had spoken, and the food was almost done. Of course, it was then that Endeavor had to speak. "Your training will have to be upped, Shuto. Those villains are going to come back and you must be prepared. Of course, you are already strong enough to fight them, but you have to take charge of your class and be at the front the next time they attack. It's only expected of you as my son." Shuto hesitated for a split second before nodding and continuing to eat. Endeavor continued talking, spewing the same bullshit he had when Izuku and Shuto first came through the door. Izuku simmered as he watched, anger flooding his veins. There was absolutely no way he was going to allow Endeavor to train Shuto any longer. He had been tuning out Endeavor, but he was sharply pulled out of his thoughts. "If you know why things keep floating around, you must inform me immediately. If it's an intruder, you are to keep them occupied until I get there. Is that understood?" Shuto nodded, "Yes, father." Endeavor seemed satisfied with the answer and the dinner fell back into silence. Shuto finished eating quickly after, and Izuku followed the boy to his room. They sat side by side on the futon. "Hey Shuto." The boy looked up at where he thought Izuku was and homed in answer. "I gathered evidence from your father's computer last night. I was wondering if there was anything you wanted to do with it. If you wanted to expose him for it." Shuto stared at him for a moment, thinking before shaking his head, no one would listen. He's the number 2 hero, no way he could do something like that. Izuku thought for a few minutes, the two falling back into comfortable silence before an idea came to him. "There's no way he's the only one, right?" Shuto looked at him, perplexed, obviously waiting for him to explain. Like there's no way he's the only hero who abuses their power or family. And he absolutely isn't the only one to use his money to pay people off. If we gathered evidence against these heroes, started small and worked our way up, then once we got to Endeavor we would have the public on our side. Shudo looked like he was about to agree before he thought of something. His brow furrowed and he shook his head. The Hero Commission would never allow it. They'd just take down any social media posts we made and they'd be able to control what news outlets put out to turn the public against us. Plus we're only kids and you're dead. No one would believe us anyway. Izuku frowned. He knew Shudo was right. There wasn't anything they could do for the moment. He sighed and flopped back onto the futon looking out the window above. The sun would be setting soon. That's when an idea came to him. He shot back up and floated in front of Shudo. Do you have a way onto your roof? Shudo was surprised by the sudden question but he answered quickly, I believe so. Why? Izuku beamed though Shudo couldn't see it. Let's watch the sunset. Shudo agreed quickly and the two left the room, walking carefully and quickly down the hall to the roof entrance. When they made it to the roof Izuku guided Shudo carefully to the spot he had sat the night before, had it only been last night. It felt like it had been years ago. The two sat on the edge of the roof, their legs swinging in front of them. They sat there in silence until the sun began to dip. The sky turned brilliant shades of orange and red, mixing together to create something beautiful and unique. Izuku hadn't realized he was solid until he felt fingers brush his hand. He looked down to see Shudo's own hand next to his. His head snapped up, expecting Shudo to be staring at him, but instead the boy was looking at the sky before them, wonder filling his eyes. Izuku smiled and followed the boy's gaze, letting the panic of being solid wash away in exchange for the calm of the setting sun. Izuku was wandering the house, exploring rooms he hadn't been in yet. It was around midnight and everyone else was asleep. He had been unable to finish his snooping the previous night so he was continuing now. He would have to be more careful since Endeavor was actually in his room. The first door on the left Izuku knew to be Endeavor's so he skipped it. Instead he checked the door across from it first. It was the office. The side walls were both covered by bookshelves filled with both books and boxes. Each box had a label and inside them were organized manila folders. Izuku looked through them for a few minutes but quickly grew bored. None of it was overly interesting and none of it was damning. Just regular heroics paperwork. Pushed against the back wall was a desk with a computer on top and a Raleigh chair in front of it. Izuku opened the computer but all it held were boring money exchanges, for things like groceries and staff salaries, and PDF versions of the papers in the boxes. Izuku sighed and left the room, instead poking his head into the room beside it. He immediately left it though, as it turned out to be Fuyumi's room and she was asleep in bed. Instead, he turned his attention to the room beside Endeavor's. Inside was a futon pushed up against the back wall, a desk on the right wall with a Raleigh chair in front of it and nothing on top, and a bookshelf on the left wall with barely any books. Izuku went over to the bookshelf and started reading the titles on the spines of the books. The shelf had 16 spots for books total. Only 6 of the spots had books in them and there were only 12 books on the shelf. 10 of the books were about medical topics or were medical textbooks and the other 2 were math textbooks. None of the books were particularly interesting and there was nothing else in the room so Izuku left and continued making his way down the hall. The next room he entered was the one beside Fuyumi's. As soon as he phased through the door he froze. There was an altar against the right wall. On the altar was a framed photo of a young boy in a gakurin. On either side of the photo were 2 vases of flowers. Beside the altar was a table with toys and a pair of shoes lined up on top. The rest of the room was much the same as the other bedroom, a futon pushed against the back wall and an empty desk on the left. Izuku left quickly, making his way to the end of the hall where the last door was. He phased through quickly and came out onto a balcony overlooking a patch of land. In the middle of the patch sat a worn-looking ball. The balcony spanned across the house like the house was hollow in the middle and this was the middle part. There was another door to Izuku's right before the corner in the wall. Izuku floated over to the door and poked his head inside only for his expression to morph into a scowl. It was another entrance to the training room. Izuku pulled his head back out and instead floated down onto the patch of grass below. The grass came up to his knees so it obviously wasn't cut very often. The ball was surrounded by the grass and hard to see. Izuku floated it up into the air and played around with it, making it spin and do loop-de-loops. He put it back after a few minutes and went back inside the house, phasing through the walls. He made it back to Shudo's room quickly, checking in on the boy before phasing through his back wall and floating up to the roof, waiting for the sun to rise. The next morning Shudo sleeps in. UA wouldn't be open until the next week due to the attack so they had 2 extra days off school. Izuku made sure that Endeavor came nowhere near Shudo's room while the boy slept and followed him to the dining room when he finally woke up. Just like yesterday, there was a plate set on the table in front of Shudo's chair except instead of bacon and eggs it was miso soup. Shudo ate quickly and put his dishes away in the kitchen before heading back to his bedroom to change. He put on a t-shirt and shorts, going to the front door once he was done. Izuku waited for the boy to put on his shoes before following him out the door, following beside him as he jogged down the sidewalk. They were silent most of the way, only starting to talk on the way back to the house. "So what do you plan to do today?" Shudo turned his head in the direction of Izuku's voice. "I'll do my basic workout and once that's done I'll scroll on my phone and maybe do some miscellaneous chores." Izuku frowned slightly. "That's no way to spend a day off." Shudo shrugged and they were silent a few minutes more until Izuku broke it again. "I'll help you with any chores and then I'll show you some of my favorite places in Mizurufu." Izuku nodded to himself. That sounded like a good plan to him. Shudo just shrugged again. "Sure." They were silent the rest of the way back. It didn't take very long to get the chores done. All they had to do was wash the dishes and the only ones there to wash were the ones from Shudo's breakfast. When Shudo was done cleaning a dish, Izuku would float it up to a rag and dry it before putting it away in its proper place. They were done in just under 10 minutes. When they were done, Izuku ushered Shudo to his room to change so they could leave. He changed into a white hoodie and jeans, pulling the hood up over his head. He had his backpack on with his wallet and phone tucked inside. Izuku was swooping around in the air beside Shudo, excited to finally get to his favorite places with someone else, and someone who could freely interact with the workers and patrons no less. They were out the door quickly, Izuku giving Shudo directions through excited whispers. He didn't need to give many directions for the way to the train station, just reminding the other boy of a certain turn he had to make, but when they made it to their stop Izuku was fully in the lead. The first place they went was a hero merch store. It was small but it had a large selection and everything was priced well. Izuku led Shudo over to the All Might section, which was certainly the biggest. He floated up one of the more discreet items, a keychain that had the colors of his hero costume as the background and written across it, in bubble font and yellow script, were the words, Plus Ultra. Izuku could tell that Shudo was about to deny it, so he argued that if his father had a problem with it he could just say that he had purchased it to show school spirit and hadn't noticed the coloring plus Endeavor was never there when they left for UA and they could take it on and off as they pleased. The corners of Shudo's mouth twitched upward slightly in an almost smile. They also purchased a sticker of Hawk's red wings, ringing their purchases up at the front before leaving the store and moving on to the next location. The next place Izuku took Shudo to was a stationery store. Sure, it wasn't too exciting, but it was one of Izuku's favorite stores. They sold notebooks at amazingly cheap prices, their pens lasted what seemed like forever, and the pen refills were pretty cheap too. Izuku only realizes the place is pretty boring and useless to Shudo when they enter through the doors since the boy already has all the school supplies he needs. Despite that, Shudo still looked around the store. Izuku got excited when they got to the notebook shelf even though he knew he couldn't buy any nor could he really use them. Shudo seemed to pick up on his excitement though and picked up 3 of the notebooks, tucking them under his arm. As he continued to look around. By the time they made it to the register, Shudo had 3 notebooks, a box of pencils, a box of pens, a box of pen refills and 2 erasers. The total was 1,960 yen, which wasn't much, but Izuku still felt a little bad about it. He vowed to himself that he'd use the notebooks at some point. The next place Izuku brought Shudo was a generic 100 yen store, so it was obvious that Shudo was a little confused, but Izuku guided him through the shelves to the specific one he wanted. On the shelf to the right were cheap wicker picnic baskets and on the shelf on the left were red and white checkered blankets. Izuku floated a picnic basket and a blanket off the shelves, moving them in front of Shudo. The boy grabbed them and they went up to the front to pay for their items. When the two got to the front of the line, the cashier started making small talk while she rang up their small purchase. "Are you going to have a picnic?" "Who with?" "Oh, I'll be on my own." The woman looked surprised at this, coughing into her fist. "Why would you go on a picnic alone?" "It's a nice day out and I enjoy being alone." "Oh, I see." She finally finished bagging their purchases and told them their total, putting the receipt in the bag. Izuku followed beside Shudo, guiding the boy to their second-to-last stop. Around 10 minutes later they reached a small restaurant that advertised their katsudon. Izuku told Shudo exactly what to order and they took it to go. Shudo took the container containing his order out of the paper bag and instead put it into the picnic basket with the blanket. He threw the paper bag into the trash as they exited the building. Izuku guided Shudo to his favorite park and once there to his favorite picnic spot. Eventually, they stopped in the middle of a ring of trees, sunlight streaming in from a place in the canopy free from leaves. Izuku helped Shudo set up the blanket and the two sat in silence. Shudo ate his katsudon and Izuku used one of the notebooks Shudo had purchased for him, scribbling in it furiously, doing his best to keep his mind off being solid. They were in a secluded area after all. When Shido finished eating, he put the garbage away in the basket and watched Izuku for a moment before the boy looked up and saw him staring. Izuku immediately panicked and let go of his solidity, the pencil he had previously been holding falling onto the open notebook. "I'm sorry, did I startle you?" Shido's head was tilted to the side slightly, his eyes where Izuku had been previously. Izuku started waving his hands frantically despite Shido being unable to see them. No, nothing like that. I just didn't expect you to be staring at me." Shido nodded. "Ah, I see, my apologies." They fell back into silence, Shido taking out his phone and Izuku just sitting there. They didn't stay long after, packing up their things and making their way back to the house. Izuku gave Shido directions to the train station and they walked the rest of the way after getting to their stop. When they arrived back at the house it was around 2 p.m., meaning Fuyumi and, more importantly, Endeavor would be home soon. Izuku helped Shido put their purchases in places where Endeavor wouldn't find them and Shido changed into a different outfit before settling down on his futon to scroll through news sites. Izuku sat with him until both Endeavor and Fuyumi returned, at which point they shared another awkward dinner before going to bed. The next day was a Friday but school was still cancelled. Izuku once again joined Shido on his morning run. When the two returned to the house, Izuku took up station at the desk in Shido's room, writing furiously in his notebook as a recent villain fight of Hawks played on the laptop in front of him. Shido was scrolling on his phone, though what he was looking at Izuku wasn't sure. It didn't take very long for Izuku to finish analyzing the video, his mind starting to wander. His mind brought him to Shido's classmates, their quirks and all the ways they could use and improve them. He grabbed 2 of the empty notebooks Shido had bought him and opened to the first page of the first book. The first student he focused on was Kaminari. The boy obviously needed ideas for quirk control and different ways to use it, and by God was Izuku going to give it to him. By the time Izuku was done analyzing Shido's class, it was time to eat lunch. He followed Shido to the kitchen, looking into the fridge with the boy. Inside they milk, uncooked chicken, 3 eggs and a small assortment of vegetables. The cupboards weren't much better, a small package of uncooked noodles, seasoning, dishes and honey. It was then that Shido told Izuku that he had no idea how to cook. Izuku smiled, floating around the kitchen as he took out pots, pans and ingredients. "That's alright, I'll show you." Once everything was laid out on the counter, Izuku brought Shido over to the cutting board. "Alright. Hold the knife like this." Izuku showed Shido how to hold the knife in his own hand first, adjusting Shido's grip when the boy tried his best to copy him. He showed Shido how to cut the chives before leaving the boy to his work, setting some water to boil and preparing the meat. It took the 2 of them longer than it would have taken just Izuku, but that didn't matter because they had fun doing it. Izuku tried to stifle a laugh as he watched Shido chop the chives, his face contorted in concentration. Some of the slices were uneven, those Shido shoved to the side. As he chopped, the slices started getting more and more even until he was barely messing up. Izuku turned away to continue seasoning the chicken. Shido was trying to season the chicken in Izuku's place as the boy had to take over chopping the carrots, Shido having been the one to ask to switch when he couldn't get an even enough cut. The boy was shaking a seasoning container over the chicken when suddenly the lid fell off and all of the powder fell out of the container. A cloud of seasoning gathered in the air and Shido turned away quickly, rubbing at his eyes and coughing. Izuku rushed over trying to see if the other boy was okay when Shido burst into laughter. Izuku paused for a moment before joining him, the boys standing, floating, folded over in the middle of the kitchen, their arms enveloping their stomachs. When they were done laughing, both had smiles plastered on their faces as they tried to salvage the chicken. They sat at the kitchen table as Shido ate. Izuku scribbled in his notebook, sitting solid at the end of the table on the same side as Shido, the other boy sitting at the other end. Izuku would occasionally look up to see Shido trying to hide the faces he was making at the taste of the food. When Shido was done eating, he dabbed at his face with a napkin and pushed his dishes away lightly. Izuku looked up, setting down his pencil and letting go of his solidity, relaxing into the feeling of intangibility. "It tasted amazing," Shido said. Izuku smiled and hid a small laugh behind his hand. "Liar." Shido shrugged and gathered his dishes as he stood, taking them into the kitchen. Izuku helped the boy wash up, the two talking animatedly as they washed and dried respectively. When they were leaving the kitchen, still talking, they heard the front door click in a way that told them someone was unlocking it. The two stood deathly still as they waited to see who would walk through. They watched the door swing open, immediately letting in the sound of conversation. Both Fuyumi and Endeavor stepped through the door, Fuyumi looking nervous as she had a one-sided conversation with the man. As soon as Endeavor had taken off his shoes and slipped into his slippers, he made a beeline for Shido, reaching out to grab the boy. Izuku pulled Shido out of the way, making sure the boy didn't hit anything as he did so. Endeavor ground his teeth. "Come along Shudo, we have training to do." Endeavor tried to reach for Shudo again, but Izuku levitated a shoe off the rack at the front door and used it to smack Endeavor in the face. The man stumbled back slightly and Izuku grabbed Shudo by the arm, pulling the boy away. They could hear Endeavor yelling in the next room, Fuyumi trying fruitlessly to placate him. Izuku pulled Shudo to the end of the second hallway, getting the boy to open the door at the end of the hall before following him out. As soon as Izuku was out the door, he closed it tight. He followed Shudo into the middle of the grassy field, watching the boy as he looked around. "I've only been out here once. My siblings were out here most of the time, so I was never allowed." Izuku floated up beside the boy, looking around with him when his eyes fell on the ball in the center of the field. His eyes lit up and a mischievous smile broke out across his face. He levitated the ball off the ground and sent it hurtling at Shudo. The other boy dodged to the side before the ball could hit him, said object stopping just behind the boy. Shudo's eyes darted over to where he assumed Izuku was. Pausing a moment before a small smile graced his face. He turned to face the ball and snatched it out of the air, turning quickly and sending it hurtling for Izuku. Izuku made himself solid, landing flat on his feet before catching the ball. He gently threw it into the air, kicking it toward Shudo. Shudo lowered into a more defensive position and kicked the ball back at Izuku when it reached him. Izuku made himself solid quickly, not having much time to dwell on it before the ball was right in front of him. He kicked the ball as soon as he was solidified, sending it back at Shudo. The two continued to kick the ball back and forth, laughing all the while. Kaminari was incredibly confused. He had been thinking about it for just over a week now and he just couldn't figure it out. During the battle trials All Might had set up for their first heroics class, he had short-circuited and started wandering the city. They had taken a bus to the fake city, so he had almost no clue as to how the hell he had come out of Hit and Recover Girl's office. Almost being the key word. He remembered being led to the bus by someone he couldn't see, but he knew it wasn't Hagakure because it didn't feel like there was really any pressure on his sleeve, almost like it was the wind. But that was impossible. None of his classmates had telepathy, levitation, or wind-based quirks, and even then he would have seen them. His memory was hazy, as it often was when he short-circuited, but there was no way he had forgotten a whole person. He thought he remembered it being cold as he was led to the bus, like there was a chill only he could feel, but that wasn't possible. It had been a nice warm day and he hadn't been cold at any point before then. He came to the conclusion it was just his short-circuited brain playing tricks on him and moved on. He resolved to ask at least one of his classmates if they knew what had happened when they returned to school on Monday. When Izuku and Shudo went back inside, they snuck through the house as quietly as they could so as not to disturb Endeavor and alert the man to their presence. It was around 4 p.m. and the house was eerily silent. The two got to Shudo's room safely, sitting down beside each other on the futon. It was only then that Izuku realized he was still solid. A bout of panic filled his stomach and he let go of it quickly, welcoming the intangibility like an old friend as he always did. Shudo barely glanced his way as the boy scrolled on his phone. Left alone with his own thoughts, Izuku could only think about how taxing the weekend was going to be, having to try and subdue Endeavor at every turn. Izuku had been right for about the first 5 hours. By then it was obvious Endeavor was ready to commit murder, something neither Izuku nor Shudo was very keen on. To combat this, the two locked the man inside his own room, barring the door with some excess furniture. They knew that man wouldn't be able to get out without causing mass destruction to the house, and why would he do that? It would only stir up trouble with the media since there would be no way for him to explain it away. How would a seasoned pro lose control of their quirk? Why would his children lock him up like that if there wasn't something else going on? Speaking of, why has his wife been in that hospital for so long? So it was safe to say that they now had the house to themselves. They started with setting up pranks for Endeavor. They set up a water bucket on the door of the bathroom only the man was allowed to use, filled his shoes with whipped cream, fogged up his mirror and wrote "fuck you" in the condensation. Shudo knew the man kept his closet delicately organized, so the two took the time to completely mess it up. They had the time of their lives. By the time it was time for UA to reopen on Monday, they were the happiest they could be. So of course everything had to go to shit. It was Monday morning and Izuku was helping Shudo get ready for school. He made sure his bag was packed and checking the breakfast was made and waiting for them. It was concerning that there were 2 plates set out instead of 1. When Shudo finally entered the kitchen, dressed in his school uniform with his bag thrown over his shoulder, he froze at the sight of his father sitting at the table eating breakfast. Izuku froze beside the boy, ready to intervene if necessary. Endeavor put down the chopsticks he had been holding, setting them down on the napkin beside his plate. He had a staring contest with his son for a few moments before he spoke up. The man's voice was even and reeked of danger. "I'm tired of the games you've been playing, Shudo," the man began. I put up with your childish rebellion of refusing to use my fire, allowed you to feel proud of yourself, but I see now that was a mistake. I allowed you to fall too far out of line, and now you think you have the right to do whatever this has been. Well, no more. I know that you've become acquainted with the one who's been wreaking havoc in this household, so you can either tell me who they are and turn them in, or we can do this the hard way. Izuku saw Shudo's eyes harden as the boy's mouth settles into a thin line. No. Endeavor immediately burst forward, activating his quirk simultaneously. A fireball was sent rocketing towards Shudo. Neither boy moved quite fast enough as Shudo got hit on the arm while trying to dodge. Izuku felt anger fill his entire being at the look on Shudo's face, at the look of the new third-degree burn that would surely scar. A scar that was fluctuating between looking like starbursts and a messed-up circle. Izuku could feel himself flickering between solidity and intangibility, but he couldn't bring himself to care. All he cared about at that moment was protecting Shudo, fulfilling his promise. The green-haired ghost burst forward, running straight for the man who was responsible for his friend's new burn. He became solid just before he collided with the man, sending him falling to the floor. Izuku let go of his solidity before hitting the ground, instead rising into the air. He levitated the dining table into the air, sending food and plates falling to the floor. He could hear Fuyumi yelling, trying to get Endeavor to stop. Instead, the man rose and readied another blast. Izuku threw the table as hard as he could, sending Endeavor back to the floor. The man hit his head on the tile with a sickening crack and went limp. Izuku could barely see blood starting to pool around the man's head from around the table. He barely registered Fuyumi rushing to the man as he slowly descended to the floor and stood on it instead of phasing through. He walked towards Shudo slowly, taking the boy by his uninjured arm and guiding him to his bedroom. They could patch him up there while simultaneously ignoring the man currently unconscious in the dining room. Izuku dressed Shudo's burn quietly and carefully, making sure it was properly dressed before packing away the first aid kit. The two continued to sit in silence on Shudo's futon, listening to the sound of sirens getting closer as an ambulance pulled into the manor's driveway to take Endeavor to the hospital. By the time the ambulance had left, Shudo was an hour late to school. The boy was adamant about going, but Izuku didn't think it was a good idea. In the end, Izuku won. Shudo changed out of his uniform while Izuku went back to the kitchen to see if there was anything for the other boy to have for breakfast, since the food that had been on the dining table was now inedible due to being thrown out. Groceries had been restocked on Sunday, so there was an abundance of things Izuku could make. To save time, he threw together a sandwich using mayo, cheese, meat, lettuce, and tomato. He brought the plate to Shudo and waited for the boy to finish eating to bring the plate back to the kitchen to be washed later. By the time he made it back to the other boy's room, he was laying on his uninjured side, scrolling through his phone. Izuku decided to leave him to it and instead went to the desk, opening one of the empty notebooks. The last one. He'd have to ask Shudo if they could go back to the store later. He sat down in the desk chair, allowing himself to become solid. He titled the notebook, Taking Down Endeavor Volume #1, and set to work. By the time Izuku was done writing down everything he had come up with in that time, he had filled just over half the notebook and just under 3 hours had passed. He glanced over at Shudo, having not noticed the time passing. The aforementioned boy was passed out on the futon, his phone laying in his open palm. Izuku felt a small smile tug at his lips and he did nothing to suppress it. He gently levitated the phone over to the dresser and lifted the blanket over the half-and-half boy. Nodding to himself, Izuku let go of his solidity and floated out of the room and down the hall to the kitchen. He could make some lunch while the other boy slept. 40 minutes later, Shudo was eating a dish of cold soba Izuku had made. The boy seemed to be enjoying it, seeing as he was eating it quickly and without trying to hide any faces as he had with the lunch the two had made together. When the boy was done eating, the two went into the kitchen and started washing the dishes together, Shudo washing them in the sink and Izuku drying them with a towel before putting them away. When they were done with the dishes, the two sat down in the living room and turned on the TV, watching some mindless reality show. Izuku continued to scribble in his notebook, which was placed open on the coffee table. Though he was solid, he likely wouldn't be much longer. He was starting to feel antsy and his left leg was starting to bounce. He finished writing the sentence he was on before putting down his pencil and flipping the notebook closed. He let go of his solidity and felt his muscles relax as he floated slightly off the couch. Shudo barely glanced over at the other boy as he went intangible, used to the feeling of the other disappearing by now. He continued to watch TV while Izuku flitted around the house, sweeping and wiping down counters. Shudo had offered to help multiple times, but each time he was waved away, Izuku muttering something about earning his stay. He had tried to help forcefully by picking up a spare broom, but Izuku had levitated it out of his grip and sat him back on the couch before getting back to work. At around 2 p.m. Izuku had finally stopped cleaning the house and had instead sat back down on the couch. It was also around this time that they heard a key slide into the lock of the front door. Fuyumi stepped in a moment later, a few plastic bags hanging from her left arm while her right closed the door. Shudo got up from his place on the couch and took the bags from her, starting to bring them to the kitchen when Fuyumi stopped him. "Oh no, those are snacks Dad would disapprove of. Hide them in Natsuo's room, he won't mind and Dad never goes in there." Shudo nodded and started heading down the hall to Natsuo's room. Once Shudo returned, Fuyumi sat with him on the couch, Izuku floating above them. "Dad will be okay to return to the house by the end of the week. He's really angry though." Izuku nodded to himself. "That's fine, I'm really sorry though. I know I messed up dash." Fuyumi looked in the direction of his voice, cutting him off. "What do you mean?" "I broke my promise." Fuyumi shook her head. "No you didn't. When Dad tried to hurt Shudo you protected him. But her got burned." Shudo butted in. "That doesn't matter. You protected me from getting hurt further and dressed the wound afterward. I'm sure that if it wasn't for you he would have nearly killed me." After that they sat in silence, Izuku thinking over their words and the two siblings watching TV together. The next morning Fuyumi joined the two boys for breakfast before they left for school. When the three were done eating, Fuyumi walked with them until she had to turn so she could get to the train station in time. The two arrived 40 minutes before homeroom and 10 minutes before Ida, so Shudo sat at his desk to read while Izuku sat at Mineta's old desk and wrote in one of his analysis notebooks. Before Ida burst through the door to the classroom, Izuku put away his notebook and pencil, letting go of his solidity and floating up above Shudo. Ida entered only a few moments later, at 8 a.m. exactly. He came up to Shudo's desk, chopping his arms in the robotic way that they always did. So much so that Izuku had added it to his notes on the boy. "Good morning, Todoroki. I was worried when you didn't so yesterday, so I am glad to see you doing well. May I ask why you were absent?" Shudo tensed marginally. The change was so small you could only notice it if you were looking for it, which Izuku was. He wanted desperately to help the boy, but before he could come to a decision on how to do so, Yoirozu walked through the door, effectively drawing Ida's attention. The rest of the class started trickling in as time wore on, some coming in groups, talking with friends they had made in the short time they had been attending the school, and others coming in alone, some with their necks bent to look at their phone. Once everyone was seated, there were around 3 minutes left before homeroom was due to start, and each was engaged either in conversation, studying, or scrolling through their phones. Shudo was one of the ones scrolling through different feeds, Izuku watching from over his shoulder. By the time there were only 2 minutes left until Aizawa was due to arrive, Tsu turned to look at Shudo, an expression on her face that led Izuku to believe she was about to ask a question. Izuku started actively willing the bell to ring early. "Todoroki?" The boy looked up from his phone and made eye contact with the girl, who didn't seem to be noticing Izuku actively signaling for her to stop, likely because he was invisible. "I was wondering why you weren't here yesterday. You don't seem like someone to miss school like that." Shudo tensed once again, a little more noticeably this time, but it was obvious no one other than Izuku noticed as the rest of the class started agreeing with Tsu and turning their attention to Shudo for an answer. The boy tenses up even more at the sudden attention, and Izuku thinks a few of the other students noticed, but he can't be sure. Shudo has been silent a little too long, and now they're starting to press him for answers, asking why he hasn't told them yet. Izuku's eyes are darting around the room as he looks for a way to get Shudo out of this when his eyes land on Shudo's phone screen. "Pro hero endeavor in hospital with head injury, villain break in the cause?" "Bingo." Izuku whispers quickly in Shudo's ear, and the split-haired boy turns his attention to the article title on his phone screen. He flips the phone so the class can read from it and pushes it forward on his desk. The first to get up from their seat to look at the screen is Tuss, as she's the one who asked the question. She reads the title of the article, nods to herself, and asks Shudo if he's okay. He tells her he's fine and she sits back at her desk. By now the rest of the class is curious, so they start crowding around the phone, trying to get a look at what Shudo was trying to show them. Each of them asks Shudo if he's okay, and each time the boy says he's fine. Izuku can tell he's uncomfortable, though a little less so than before, as he has a solid answer to their previous onslaught of questions. Before everyone is back in their own seat, the door opens to reveal their homeroom teacher, his bright yellow sleeping bag tucked under his arm. When the still standing students spot him, they rush to get back in their seats before the lesson starts. Shudo tucks his phone back into his backpack and turns his attention to their teacher, who has started writing on the board with chalk. Izuku can see that some of the tension has left the other boy's shoulders, and he smiles slightly to himself, looking up at the front of the room when Aizawa turns to address the class. The UA Sports Festival will take place 2 weeks from now. Feel free to reserve different gyms and training rooms if needed. The man then crawled into his sleeping bag and flopped down beneath the podium, leaving the class to talk amongst themselves. Many turned to their desk neighbors or moved down to their friends' desks to talk about the upcoming festival. They all left Shudo alone, allowing him to pull out his phone and start scrolling through different sites until the end of homeroom. When the bell finally rang to release them for lunch, the class found their exit blocked by a herd of students. Izuku recognized a few of them from Class 1B, but the rest he couldn't place. He hadn't had a chance to visit any of the other courses yet, which was upsetting, especially because it meant he didn't know most of these students' names. The group burst into a cacophony of noise when the door opened as 1A tried to figure out why they were there. Bakugo stepped forward and started setting off small explosions in his hands to get the students to move out of his way before turning his attention back to his own class. Isn't it obvious? They're here to take a look at their competition for the sports festival. Bakugo then walked away, heading for the cafeteria and leaving the rest of his class to deal with the crowd. A blonde boy that Izuku recognized as Minoma Nito from Class 1B stepped to the front of the group and started talking. So this is the great Class 1A? I only see 18 students here. Of course, that arrogant boy left, so that accounts for one, but where is the other, I wonder? Were they not good enough for your great and mighty class? Uraraka stepped forward to meet the boy. That's right, actually. Mineta was a perverted asshole who didn't deserve to have ever been in our class in the first place. That seemed to startle Minoma a bit as he paused for a moment before continuing. Well, despite there being an open spot, I'm sure at least one of you will be replaced. That's the magic of the sports festival. Those who didn't get into the hero course on the first go or who want to move up can do so if they perform well. I'd watch your backs if I were you. With that, the boy left, leading the rest of the herd away. Some of them gave one last glare to the class over their shoulder as they walked away, but none of them spoke. Tentatively, Class 1A left their classroom and started heading for the cafeteria. The only one who didn't was Shudo, who started making his way towards the rooftop. Izuku's care for the cement floors and the sky had rubbed off on the boy, and they both now enjoyed sitting peacefully on rooftops, letting the wind whip through their hair and clothes. Shudo had decided that they would be eating on the rooftop today since Fuyumi had made him a bento so he wouldn't have to go to the cafeteria. When they got to the rooftop, they were the only ones there. As the wind whipped through Shudo's hair and clothes and passed through Izuku, the two looked for a good place to sit. They decided on a bench at the edge of the roof, in front of the fence blocking off the edge. Instead of facing away from the fence as seemed intended, Shudo tucked his legs between the bench and fence, facing the horizon. Izuku floated beside the boy, his legs crisscrossed as he hovered above the bench. The two sat in silence for a few minutes while Shudo ate his bento. The silence was interrupted, however, when the rooftop entrance creaked open. Both boys turned to look at whoever was coming through the door, only to see the blonde boy from before glaring at Shudo. What are you doing here? You're Endeavor's son, aren't you? Surely you're the most popular kid in your class. Shudo tensed when the boy brought up his father, his eyes becoming cold as he returned the boy's glare. Izuku could tell that if he let this continue there would be consequences, and he didn't really want either Minoma or Shudo to get in trouble. Izuku reached into Shudo's pocket and took out his phone, making sure to hide from sight as he brought up one of the many news articles covering Endeavor's injury. He drew Shudo's attention carefully, handing him the phone. Shudo understood what Izuku wanted him to do, though he clearly wasn't happy about it. Begrudgingly he showed the phone screen to Minoma. The boy's eyes widened as he read the headline. He apologized tersely before making his way to a bench near the door, as far from Shudo as he could get. The two ate in silence as Izuku watched. He had moved to float in front of Shudo, if slightly above, so he could keep an eye on both of them. When the warning bell rang, the two rose and left for the door. Minoma got there first since he was right next to it, hurrying down the stairs. Shudo followed behind the other boy at a slower pace. Shudo and Izuku made it back to the 1A classroom just in time for Shudo to sit down at his desk before the last bell rang. A few moments after it had, All Might came bursting through the door. Get your costumes on and head down to Gym Gamma. I'll explain what we'll be doing when we get there. Shudo grabbed his case from the wall and followed the rest of his class out the door to the change rooms. Izuku levitated his analysis book from Shudo's backpack and caught up to the boy quickly, shoving the book into his hand so no one would see a floating book. Shudo took the notebook easily, holding it in the hand without the case. When Shudo had finished changing into his costume, Izuku came up to his side to whisper in his ear. Flip to page 5 in the notebook and rip out it and page 6, then please hand them to Hagakure. They're notes for a better costume. Shudo nodded discreetly and took out the directed pages. He handed them to Hagakure, watching her as she supposedly read what was on the page. "Oh, thank you so much, Todoroki. I'll be sure to submit these for a new costume." Shudo nodded and turned away from the girl, instead focusing on the rest of the class pouring out of the change rooms. Shudo tucked the notebook into a hidden pocket of his costume, waiting for the rest of the class to gather so All Might could start the lesson. Izuku hovered above the class, dividing his attention between them and All Might. He didn't trust the man. Not after the rooftop, not after the first heroics lesson, and certainly not after the USJ. The attack hadn't been All Might's fault, but if the man had stopped to think, had let the other heroes who were patrolling do their jobs, then no one would have gotten hurt and maybe Izuku wouldn't have had to possess the Nomu. It had certainly drawn the attention of the teachers and the students. For today's lesson you'll be playing a version of hide and seek. There will be 3 different groups, each with 2 teams, the hiders and the seekers. The seekers must find the hiders within the time limit. In order for a hider to be counted as found, the seeker must apprehend them, either by wrapping them in capture tape, handcuffing them, or incapacitating them in some other way, as long as they are unable to move. Of course, the man had found a way to make a game as simple as hide and seek revolve around fighting and quirks. Look up at the screen to see what group and team you're part of. A holographic screen popped up in front of the class, displaying the group and team each student was part of. Shudo was in group 2 and was on the seeking team. Of course, Izuku wasn't surprised. Shudo converged with his team: Mina, Uraraka, Kaminari, Kirishima, and Bakugu. Shudo, Bakugu, and Kaminari were seekers while Mina, Uraraka, and Kirishima were hiders. The first group, Aoyama, Tsu, Ida, Ojiro, Shiro, Hagakure, and Yoiorozu, split into their separate teams. The hiders, Tsu, Ojiro, Shiro, and Hagakure, spreading out across the fake city, while the seekers, Aoyama, Ida, Yoiorozu, stayed in place, waiting for the buzzer to sound and let them go. Group 1's run lasted 40 minutes. Tsu was found by Aoyama, attached to the ceiling of one of the many fake buildings. She had gotten all the way down to the ground floor before Aoyama managed to shoot her down from her place with one of his lasers and cuff her wrists. Ojiro was found by Ida, who saw the boy swinging onto a rooftop by his tail. He was quick to run up the stairs of the building to the roof. When he got there, he started circling the boy with the capture tape in hand, making the other boy look like he was wrapped in a cocoon when he was done. Shiro was found by Yoiorozu, who found him taped to the ceiling of a building near the edges of the city. His was a quick capture. Hagakure was found through a team effort. Yoiorozu made large batches of flour and handed them out to her other 2 teammates. They started throwing flour around the city until finally, one of Ida's handfuls landed on the invisible girl. Yoiorozu came running from around a nearby corner when she heard Ida call that he had found Hagakure, and she helped him capture her. Group 2, Shudo's group, was up next. Shudo was a seeker, which made sense based on what Izuku knew about All Might's biases. The seeking team had to wait at the entrance to the fake city for 5 minutes to allow the hiding team to find their spots. The buzzer went as soon as the 5 minutes ended. Immediately Kaminari and Bakugu rushed forward into the city, bursting into nearby buildings to try and find the hiders: Mina, Uraraka, and Kirishima. Shudo wandered through the city carefully, investigating alleys and looking up at rooftops. Izuku stayed near the other boy but didn't give him any hints as to where the hiders were. It was 10 minutes into the exercise and none of the hiders had been found yet. Izuku theorized with Shudo that Kaminari wasn't thorough enough and Bakugu was loud enough that anyone within his vicinity would get a clear warning and move before they could be found. Shudo made his way to the back of the city carefully and quietly. The first building he entered was made to look more run down, the walls crumbling slightly and covered in graffiti. Shudo scoured the ground floor but didn't find anything. He took the stairs up to the next floor where he finally found someone. Uraraka had floated up to the ceiling of a closet in the second room to the right of the staircase. She was hidden behind a few boxes but was found easily when Shudo moved one of them. Before the girl could deactivate her quirk and land on the ground, Shudo froze her in a block of ice. All Might's voice came over the speakers a few moments later. Uraraka has been found by Todoroki. 2 hiders left. Shudo unfroze Uraraka and she set off out of the building to return to the observation room. Shudo searched the rest of the building but didn't find anything. He exited the building and picked another at random to search. The building he had picked had not been chosen as a hiding place by anyone else. He decided to move more to the front of the city, using his ice to create a path to skate on and get there faster. When Shudo was just over halfway to where he wanted to be, he heard an explosion and the sounds of a crumbling building. The boy sped up and Izuku shouted to him as he prepared to rush ahead. "I'm going to investigate and see if I can help." Shudo nodded and Izuku left the boy behind, going as fast as he could towards the sounds of fighting and destroyed buildings. When Izuku reached the scene he stopped, stunned. Kaminari was wandering off to the side, his hands in a thumbs-up gesture in front of him in a clear sign he had shorted out. Mina and Kirishima were both running from Bakugo. The boy was blasting himself this way and that, destroying buildings and almost burning Kaminari on multiple occasions as he tried to catch the two. Mina and Kirishima were scrambling over fallen debris, obviously scared for their lives. Izuku waited 10 seconds for All Might to tell Bakugo to stop, to call off the exercise. But he didn't. Of course he didn't. It looked like Kirishima and Mina would be able to evade Bakugo a little longer, so Izuku decided to focus on Kaminari. As soon as he made it to the boy's side he levitated the boy's sleeve and dragged him away from the line of fire to the doors of the observation room. He tore the doors off the hinges and dragged the boy inside before righting the doors and darting back through them. When he got back, Shudo had just arrived and was trying to keep Bakugo from killing Kirishima and Mina, exercise forgotten. Bakugo was now trying to explode Shudo in order to get to Mina and Kirishima. Izuku rushed towards Shudo, getting in between him and Bakugo, though he didn't really know what that would accomplish. Bakugo was gearing up for a big explosion and Shudo had used too much of his ice earlier to put up a barrier. In a panic, Izuku levitated some of the debris off the ground, sending it spinning between Shudo and Bakugo like he had with the training equipment. The explosion went off on the wall of debris, breaking some of the pieces apart. Izuku pulled the pieces into the wall, filling in some of the cracks and holes. Finally, All Might's voice came over the speakers. "Group 2, please return to the observation room. There is a villain on campus." Izuku only let the debris fall when he was sure Bakugo was going back to the observation room. Shudo was staring in Izuku's general direction, a look of unease on his face. It was now that what All Might had said fully set in. Fuck. Izuku, panicking, follows Shudo, Katsuki, Kirishima, and Mina up to the observation room. He phases through the door to get inside. The five arrive just in time to hear All Might finish getting off the phone with Nedzu, alerting the principal of the supposed villain on campus. Alarms start going off, alerting the rest of the students and staff of the intruder. Izuku hopes it doesn't go as wrong as the last time the alarms went off. Izuku sticks close with Shudo and before much time has passed Aizawa comes running through the door. What happened? He closes the door behind himself and walks up to All Might. The blonde smiles at Aizawa. Izuku thinks that the reaction is a little inappropriate for the situation. All Might called Aizawa down to investigate. It quickly becomes apparent that Aizawa shares Izuku's sentiment as he gets up in All Might's face to yell at him. Stop smiling. You're the one to report a villain on campus, so you're the one who needs to tell me what happened. All Might didn't stop smiling, which obviously angered Aizawa, but before the man could forward his point All Might started explaining. Well, you see Aizawa, the lesson was going well. Young Bakugo was trying to catch young Mina and Kirishima when Shudo arrived, supposedly to help his teammate. Instead he started trying to stop Bakugo from catching the other two. Bakugo was trying to get the other boy to help him when the debris started floating around Shudo, surrounding the boy. Bakugo tried to rescue the boy but only managed to add debris to the whirlwind. Of course, none of the students have quirks that could have done such a thing, at least, none that were out in the city. So I called in an intruder. Aizawa's expression clearly portrayed what he was thinking. His eyes were slightly wide and incredulous and his mouth was open slightly. He was thinking the same thing as Izuku. All Might is a massive fucking idiot. Let me get this straight. You have my class, who are first years and barely trained, run an exercise where they fought each other in an open environment when they have yet to have the proper safety training. You stayed up here instead of being down where you could stop or protect them should something go wrong. You're upset with Todoroki for protecting his classmates, but I'm sure that if he deemed it necessary then it was, yet you did nothing. You then see some kind of force protecting Todoroki from Bakugo and deem them a villain? Was anyone actually hurt outside of injuries they sustained from your stupid training exercise? Yaoyorozu answered before All Might could. No sir. No injuries were sustained from unseen villains. Aizawa nodded. Thank you, Yaoyorozu. All Might stood silent as Aizawa interacted with the students. Likely in shock that Aizawa would call his training exercise stupid in front of the class. Izuku stayed as silent as he could above Shudo, watching everyone carefully. A few minutes later, Nedzu came through the observation room door. Upon seeing the principal, Izuku nearly had a heart attack. Thank you for staying with the class, Aizawa. I am happy to report that no life forms were detected. However, I do believe this incident is connected to the others we've had. All Might looked like he was about to ask what Nedzu meant, but Aizawa had caught on immediately. You mean the muttering, your pencil, and the Nomo? Nedzu nodded. I believe we may have a ghost on our hands, or at least someone with a ghost-like quirk. Aizawa nodded, but All Might just looked more confused than he had before. Izuku flinched. He was going to be caught soon. Oh god, what were they going to do when they did? Nezu turned his attention to Shudo. Since the presence was protecting you, Todoroki, do you know what or who was doing it? Shudo tensed but didn't answer, which of course was answer enough. I promise that if you tell me, I'll try my best to minimize their punishment. They don't seem to be nefarious. Izuku floated down to Shudo's ear. Can you get him out into the hall? I'll reveal myself there and tell him myself. Shudo nodded, both to Nezu and Izuku. He weaved through his classmates to the door, opening it before turning to look at Nezu. Would it be alright if we talk in the hall? Nezu nodded. Of course. Shudo held the door open for the principal before following him out into the hall. Once the door was firmly closed behind them, Izuku came down from beside Shudo. He let himself become solid, grabbing Shudo's hand as soon as he could do so. Being solid had gotten easier with how much he had been doing it, but this time felt more like when he had been digging through Endeavor's computer and he needed some form of support. Luckily, Shudo was more than willing to be that support. Nezu didn't betray any emotion. For a panicked moment, Izuku thought he was going to be arrested then and there, but when no one came barreling down the hall yelling at him to put his hands up, he took a deep breath. My name is Izuku Midoriya. I've been dead for, I think 11 months now. When I died I thought I was quirkless, but I'm pretty sure this ghost form is my quirk since I haven't seen any other ghosts. Nezu nodded, he seemed to be doing that a lot. Would you mind telling me how you died? Izuku flinched. Shudo gave his hand an encouraging and comforting squeeze. I jumped. Nezu's eyes widened slightly at that. Obviously, he hadn't been expecting that. Would you be okay with telling me why? Izuku lowered his head slightly in thought. There were a lot of reasons, but he knew the one Nezu would focus on is All Might. But it wasn't like he was a good teacher, in fact he was anything but. And it was obvious from what Izuku had observed that he actually wasn't that good of a hero, always using too much force. If this is what it took to at least get him removed from his teaching position, then Izuku was more than happy to share. I'm quirkless. The two ways people would treat me were something to be beaten and discarded or something more delicate than China. I'd always wanted to be a hero, but no matter who I talked to they all said something along the lines of me not being good enough due to my quirk status, though some were nicer about it than others. I guess the shattering point is when All Might left me on a rooftop and point blank said no. Izuku kept his head down, tears welling in his eyes. He was about to let go of his solidity when Nezu said something that had his head shooting up in surprise. Well, Midoriya, how would you feel about joining the hero course? What? Izuku's expression is entirely confused. The question had caught him by such surprise that he could barely feel the panic that had been rising in him. Shudo gave his hand a squeeze, causing him to realize he hadn't really answered the principal. He took another moment to think but finally figured out how he wanted to answer. With a question of his own. Just to clarify, I just told you that no one has ever said I can be a hero. That even All Might himself, who is on the other side of that door, said no. So basically you're asking me if I want to rub it in their faces. Nezu nodded, a mischievous smile overtaking his face. That is exactly what I'm asking you to do. A similar smile spreads across Izuku's face. Then yes, I'd love to join your hero course. Perfect. Nezu exclaims. I'll have you added to 1A since they have an open space. Aizawa will teach you hand-to-hand one-on-one. If you can please come up with a design for the hero course and give them some of your hair, they can make you a costume that will work with your quirk. Izuku nodded as Nezu spoke, following along. When the chimera was done speaking, Izuku asked a question. Would it be possible for me to learn more about intelligence and investigation heroes? I'd like to learn how to fight and engage with villains, but I also want to be able to stay out of fights and make plans as they happen and gather information through infiltration. It seemed impossible, but somehow Nezu's smile grew sharper. Not in a way that said he was angry or was planning something malicious, but in a way that signaled he was even happier. That is certainly doable. If it's okay with you, I'd like to see some of your analysis. Can you bring some examples up to my office now? Izuku nodded quickly. I just need to stop at the 1A classroom. My current notebook is in Shudo's bag. Nezu nodded and Izuku gently let go of Shudo's hand, nudging the boy back towards the observation room. He nodded and opened the door, stepping inside before it shut behind him. Izuku started walking down the hall as Nezu followed behind him. The panic of being solid for so long without someone to ground him was starting to climb again, but it was overshadowed by the pure joy Izuku felt. He was finally getting a chance to be a hero. When they reached the gates to the fake city, a bus was waiting there with its doors open. Izuku gets a feeling of déjà vu. He sits down in the seat closest to the front and Nezu sits in the seat across from him on the other side of the aisle. The ride back to the main UA building is silent. Izuku feels himself fade in and out of solidity. He tries his best to stay solid as it seems like the polite thing to do. When they finally arrive at the building, Izuku phases through the bus walls before landing beside Nezu and taking up pace with him. He finds it much slower to walk than to just float through the halls, but it would be rude to rush so far ahead of the principal, and he wants more time to soak it all in. He was actually going to be a student of UA in the hero course no less. Yes, he had been attending the classes anyway, but that wasn't the same. When they reach the door to 1A, Izuku slides it open and steps inside. He quickly walks to the back of the classroom, where Shudo's desk is located. He unzips the bag and takes out the notebook pushed against the back of the bag. It's labeled Class 1A Analysis Number 1. Izuku is quick to make his way back to the doorway where Nezu stands, waiting. Once Izuku is beside the mammal, he starts walking again. Izuku matches his pace and they make their way silently to Nezu's office. When they reach the large double doors, Nezu pushed the one on the right open from the bottom, holding it open for Izuku. The boy thanks him quietly before making his way into the room and sitting down in the chair in front of the desk. When Nezu is situated in his chair on the other side of the desk, Izuku places the notebook directly in the center of the desk. Nezu picks it up and starts flipping through the pages. To someone who hadn't studied the pro closely like Izuku had, he had wanted to know everything about the person who would one day be his principal. It might look like he wasn't paying attention to what was written at all. In fact, it was quite the opposite. He was committing everything written down to memory. When he was done, he set the book back where Izuku had put it. Your analysis is unlike any I have ever seen before from someone your age. In fact, it exceeds that of most pro analysts I have met. How would you feel about me taking over one of your academic lessons to teach you analysis and other such skills? This was becoming too much. First, he's invited and accepted into the hero course, and next Nezu is offering to sacrifice some of his own time to teach Izuku specifically? This had to be a dream. The words that Izuku wanted to say felt stuck in his throat. All he could do was nod. This day couldn't get any better. Nezu turned to his computer, typing as he spoke. Perfect. You may continue living with the Todorokis, though I'm sure you'll want to get in touch with your mother. His mother? Izuku had completely forgotten about her. So much had been happening, there had been so many things to do that the woman had slipped his mind entirely. What was she going to think? What was she going to say? Izuku had known that he could easily contact others since the first month, that he could live as a normal human since the second. Was she going to be angry that he hadn't come back to her sooner? It was only recently that things started getting busy. He had had almost 10 months exactly to get in contact with her, but he hadn't. You'll of course have some catching up to do, but I'm sure you'll be on the same level as your peers in no time. Does all of that sound okay to you? Izuku only then realized that he had accidentally tuned out Nezu. He just nodded in agreement as Nezu reached over to grab a document emerging from the printer. Perfect. Here is your schedule. It's not mandatory for you to wear the uniform considering your quirk, but you can if that's what you want. Izuku nodded, giving the principal a quick thank you before letting go of his solidity after what felt like forever. Instead of going through the door, he phased through the back wall of the office and out onto the grounds. The paper is floating along beside him as he makes his way back to the fake city to intercept Shudo. Jesus, what was he going to do about his mom? Izuku made a pit stop at the Class 1A classroom to collect Shudo's bag and make sure everything was in order. When he made it back to the city, the class was starting to stream into the change rooms. He stayed behind a building so he could watch to see when Shudo would exit, but All Might wasn't able to see him. When Shudo emerged from the change room, Izuku darted down, handing off the boy's backpack before excitedly shoving his new schedule in his face. Shudo plucked it out of the air as the classmates that had also come out of the change rooms watched. A smile broke out across Shudo's face as he read the paper. That's great, Izuku. Do you want to get a uniform or no? Yeah. I don't think I'll wear it always, but it would be good to have one. Shudo nodded. The rest of his classmates and All Might were staring at him with startled expressions on their faces. Not only had the boy smiled, but he was talking to a disembodied voice. We can get you a backpack from the store near the house and some stationery from that shop you showed me. Izuku was nodding excitedly, but it took him a moment to remember Shudo couldn't see him. Okay. When we get back, I'll need to design a costume and cut my hair. They need it so they can make a costume that will work with my quirk. Shudo nodded. All right. Fuyumi can do that. You ready to go? Yup. Shudo tucked Izuku's schedule into his bag and started walking to the gates of the city where a new bus was waiting. Young Todoroki, wait a moment. He turned around to face All Might. Izuku floated up above him. Who was it you were talking to? I would hope it wasn't that villain. Nezu should have taken care of them. Izuku was furious. Didn't the man think for a second that if Izuku was there that Nezu had allowed him to be? And had he not actually been listening to what they were saying? If he had been, he would have realized that Izuku had become a student of UA. Izuku floated down so he was in front of Shudo and between the boy and All Might. He let himself become solid despite the fact that he felt he had been solid enough for the day. When his feet touched the ground, he took pleasure in the way All Might's eyes widened in surprise at his sudden appearance. "Hello, All Might. No, I'm not a villain. I've actually recently been enrolled as a student at UA. Specifically Class 1A. Izuku held out his hand and Shudo unzipped his bag and placed the schedule in his upturned palm. Izuku handed the paper to All Might, who read it over. When All Might was finally done reading, he didn't hand the paper back to either of them. Instead, he clenched it in his fist, scrunching up the paper. "I'll have to talk to Nezu about this. You didn't take the entrance exam and you've been on UA campus illegally for who knows how long. Since the first day of school. Well, that's even more reason for you to not be accepted. I don't know what's going through Nezu's head, but it's wrong. Nezu is the most intelligent being in Japan and likely the world. Are you telling me that the decision he made is wrong?" "Yes. Really, I don't understand why he's principal in the first place. This man was really testing Izuku's patience and he has had enough. He's principal because he's smarter than any human being. He can run multiple scenarios through his head at the same time to determine the most likely outcome and make plans faster than anyone else. He can determine how dangerous or safe something is based off these scenario run-throughs, and based on your training exercises, you haven't been running them past him like you're supposed to, because I know for a fact that he would never have allowed any of the exercises you've run so far. Furthermore, you are completely unfit to be teaching children, and the only reason you were hired is because you're the #1 hero and the Hero Commission didn't let Nezu turn you away. I'm the #1 hero. There is no one more fit to be teaching young heroes. There is someone more fit. Literally, every other hero staffed at this school is more fit. They wouldn't put all the kids with unsavory quirks on the villain team each time. They would know how to deal with barely trained teenagers in ways that wouldn't get anyone killed or seriously injured. They would know when a fight is getting out of hand. And they certainly wouldn't leave a child alone on a rooftop after crushing their dreams." It was silent. No one spoke. Izuku could feel everyone's attention on him. He knew that one of the people staring was Bakugo. He hoped the boy wouldn't do anything, wouldn't say anything. He doesn't think he could handle it right now. He sees All Might's grip loosen on his schedule and he levitates it out of his grip. He uses so much force that the paper almost tears, but luckily it stays in one piece. He unzips Shudo's bag and slips the paper inside. He picks up the bag and hands it to Shudo before finally letting go of his solidity. He doesn't think he'll be able to do that again today, and likely not tomorrow either. Izuku floats ahead of Shudo to the gates, the boy following behind. The two are almost to the gates when the rest of the class gathers themselves and follows after. The bus ride back to UA is silent. No one talks. The only sound is the tires of the bus as they run over the concrete. When the bus reaches the UA gates, everyone files off and heads in their own direction to get home. No one follows Shudo and Izuku, for which both boys are grateful. When they return home, Izuku's excitement has returned, though not in the force it had been earlier. Izuku races to Shudo's room to start designing a costume. Shudo sits with him at the desk to do his homework and watch the ghost work. When Fuyumi returns home, she is immediately bombarded by Izuku to help him cut his hair, but he makes her promise to do it tomorrow. "I've had enough of being solid for one day." Fuyumi nods. She goes into the kitchen to start dinner, and the two boys watch TV in the living room until the door opens. Through the door comes Endeavor. He's dressed in casual clothes and he looks ready to murder someone. When he spots Shudo on the couch, both boys are surprised when all he does is glare and go to his own room. The two watch until he disappears behind the closed door. They watch the door for a moment before their attention is drawn back to the TV. And remember everyone, the UA Sports Festival takes place at the end of next week. Be sure to purchase tickets now before they're all sold out. The two boys stare at the TV before Izuku voices what they were both thinking. "Shit. We forgot about the sports festival." The next day, Izuku and Fuyumi woke up early so they could cut Izuku's hair. He fiddled in the chair the entire time and bolted out of it, no longer solid, the moment Fuyumi said he could. He had stayed up all of last night designing a new costume, tucking the finished product into one of Shudo's old bags. Izuku would be sharing Shudo's textbooks until they could get him his own that night. He already had some of his own stationery because of the trip they had taken about a week ago. Izuku opted out of wearing the school uniform that day. He knew it was his first day, but he didn't want to be solid longer than maybe hero training. He was rushing around the Todoroki estate all morning, full of energy at the prospect of finally being able to attend his dream school and become a hero. When it was time for the two boys to leave, Fuyumi convinced Izuku to become solid for a moment so she could give him a hug. Izuku returned the hug readily and he was beaming when Fuyumi let him go. Izuku levitated his bag along as he floated beside Shudo. He was constantly rushing between being ahead of Shudo and darting back to him, not wanting to leave the boy behind. Shudo had a small smile on his face. He could see Izuku's bag darting back and forth and he was happy for his friend. Shudo picked up the pace he was walking at so Izuku would be more content with staying at his side instead of constantly rushing back and forth. Shudo noticed civilians starting at Izuku's floating bag as they passed, but he ignored them. When they reached the UA gates, Izuku unzipped the front pouch of his bag and removed his student ID for the sensors. Shudo went in after the boy, his smile widening slightly at the sight of his spinning bag, a clear sign the boy was happy about finally being on campus legally. Shudo had to run in order to keep up with Izuku, who was going almost as fast as he could to get to the 1A classroom. When Izuku arrived at the door, he pulled it open, darting inside before Shudo even turned the corner. The classroom was empty, not even Ito was there yet. Izuku found the desk that belonged to Mineta, though only for a day, and put his bag on the hook next to it. Shudo came in through the still open door moments later. Shudo went over to his own desk, hanging his bag from its hook. He pulled out his phone and started scrolling through different feeds, occasionally looking up to see if he could spot Izuku messing with something. 10 minutes later, Ida came bursting through the door. He came over to Shudo, wishing him good morning. It was when he turned to go to his own desk that he noticed Izuku's bag on the hook of Mineta's old desk. "Ah, you're the new student, right? I'm sorry but I didn't catch your name." Izuku smiled despite knowing Ida couldn't see. "I'm Midoriya Izuku. It's a pleasure to formally meet you, Ida." Ida nodded, his arm chopping along with it. "It's a pleasure to meet you as well. I know you've been at the school for a while, but still, if you have any questions, feel free to ask." Izuku nodded. "Well, do." Ida nodded, going over to his desk and sitting down. He hung his bag from the hook on the side of his desk and took out a textbook, a notebook and a pencil case. He bent over his work, concentration clear on his face. Izuku flitted between Ida and Shudo, looking over both their shoulders to see what they were working on or looking at. A few minutes later, Yoyorozu walked through the door. She greeted Ida and Shudo, heading for her own desk when she, like Ida, noticed Izuku's bag on the desk that was now his. "Oh, good morning. You're the one who talked with All Might yesterday, right? The new student?" "Yup, that's me. Midoriya Izuku, nice to meet you." "Yoyorozu Momo, nice to meet you, Midoriya." She smiled at him as she continued to her seat. He returned the smile despite her not being able to see. As the clock ticked closer to the start of class, more and more students of Class 1A trickled in, each one greeting Izuku, whether it be because they noticed his bag, because they remembered him saying he was joining the class, or because of the prompting of their friends. Bakugo was the only one who didn't say anything. He just stared at Izuku's bag on its hook. The plain black, a stark contrast to his former bright yellow. A few minutes after everyone was seated, the bell signaling the start of class rang. Everyone immediately straightened themselves out, cutting off conversations and looking to the front. Izuku did the same, hovering just above his chair. A second later, the door opened, revealing Aizawa with his yellow sleeping bag tucked under his arm. He walked into the class silently, closing the door behind him as he stared at them. He put the sleeping bag under the podium, supposedly on a shelf, before sighing. "We have a new student. Come to the front and introduce yourself." Izuku floated up to the front, touching down on the ground lightly as he let himself become solid. He twisted his fingers behind his back, trying to ward off the sick, panicky feeling that was worse than it had been in months. His smile was wobbly as he looked out at the class. He couldn't help but note how Bakugo stared at him, eyes wide. "Hi. I'm Midoriya Izuku. Yes, I'm the one who yelled at All Might yesterday. Please don't ask any questions about it." Izuku let go of solidity as soon as the last word was out of his mouth. He hovered just above the floor, taking deep breaths as he tried to quell the feeling of an oncoming panic attack. He floated back over to his desk, continuing the deep breathing as he hovered crisscross above his chair. "Alright, do what you want, just keep it quiet." With that, Aizawa grabbed the sleeping bag from where he had put it beneath the podium and walked over to a corner of the classroom. He climbed into the sleeping bag and leaned back against the wall, closing his eyes. As soon as he was leaning against the wall, people started moving. Some grouped up with their friends, some took out workbooks to work on homework, and some took out their phones, leaning back in their chairs. Bakugo stood up from his desk, pushing past the four swarming him on his way to the door. He had his backpack slung over his shoulder as he threw the door open and stepped out of the classroom. Izuku looked around, and after ensuring Shudo was engaged in conversation with Ida, Yoyorozu, and Uraraka, He followed after Bakugu, phasing through the door and rushing through the air to catch up with him. Izuku caught up to Bakugu as he was walking down the hall. The hall was deserted, all the doors lining the walls closed. Izuku continues to follow Bakugu down the hall until they reach a staircase, at which point the other boy spins on his heel to face Izuku. "I know you're there. Fucking show yourself already." Startled, Izuku falls backward. He rights himself quickly and, seeing the anger on Bakugu's face, turns himself solid and falls back on the floor. He moves just fast enough to avoid a right hook. Because he had to dodge the punch, Izuku ends up switching places with Bakugu, his back to the stairs while Bakugu's is now facing the empty hall. "Stop dodging and fight back, you fucking coward." Izuku had just enough time to notice Bakugu's eyes watering before he had to dodge another punch. Bakugu kept attacking, yelling at Izuku to fight back all the while. Izuku continued to dodge Bakugu's attacks until he got himself backed into a corner, pressed against the railing on the stairs. He could hear the familiar crackle of explosions and instinctively threw his arms up in front of his face. Only a moment later he felt the burn of those explosions on his arms, except they weren't as hot as he remembered. In fact, all he really felt was heat. It didn't feel like they were burning him at all. It was only when he opened his eyes to see Bakugu looking at him through the part in his arms did he even realize he had closed them. Tears were slowly starting to fall from the other boy's eyes, but it didn't seem like he noticed them at all. "Why? Why did you just disappear for a year just to show up here? You made all of us think you were dead. There was a fucking funeral and Auntie Inko bawled her fucking eyes. I thought it was all my fault. And you think it's okay to just show up here and what? Make fun of me? Look down on me? Show me that you're better? Wait, what?" Izuku pushed Bakugu back, causing the boy to stumble back a few steps. "Why would I come here just to make fun of you? Why does everything have to be about you? Did you ever think, just maybe, that I came here to be a hero? That I didn't want anything to do with you? And I'm sorry I didn't make contact, I'm sorry that you were forced to attend a funeral, but I was trying to deal with the fact that only after I jumped did I develop a quirk. I was trying to come to terms with the fact that everything you had put me through, everything I had put myself through, was for nothing. And you know what? You're one of the reasons I jumped. So there, are you happy now?" Bakugu was silent, staring at Izuku. Huffing, tears falling down his face, Izuku pushed past the other boy and out into the hall, walking back to class. By the time lunch had rolled around, Bakugu still hadn't returned to class, causing Izuku to worry. But he didn't want to worry about the other boy. So instead, he levitated both his and Shudo's bags out of the classroom and down the hall, heading toward the roof. Shudo followed after him quietly, walking alongside the floating bags. When they reached the door to the roof, Shudo stepped in front of Izuku and opened the door. Shudo walked through first, holding it open for Izuku. He put their bags down in the center of the floor and sat down next to them with Shudo. Shudo opened his bag and took out a bento box, opening it carefully. While Shudo ate, Izuku thought about the fight he had had with Bakugu. He felt bad about not contacting anyone within the 10 months he had known about his quirk, but had he really caused that much distress? He knew his mom would have missed him, he knew she would have cried, but that's not the part that confused him. The part that confused him was that Bakugu made it sound like he cared. What? He was the one who had bullied him since they were 4. He was the one who had told him to jump. How much could his death really have affected him? But there was something else bothering Izuku too. Bakugu hadn't called him Deku once throughout the entire fight. Again, why? It had been a prominent insult their entire childhood, following them from preschool to middle school. Why stop now? Did Bakugu really care about him enough to stop? Izuku was startled out of his train of thought by the sound of the rooftop door opening. Bakugu stepped through the door, closing it gently behind him. He didn't notice Shudo sitting in the middle of the roof until he had taken a few steps forward. "The hell are you doing here, icy hot?" Shudo shrugged, glancing over at where Izuku was floating a few inches off the ground, invisible. Bakugu followed his gaze, eyes widening slightly when he realized why Shudo was looking where he was. Whatever. He was turning to leave the roof when Izuku called out to him. "Why do you care?" Bakugu froze, turning back to face Izuku, who was now standing on the rooftop, staring him down. "Why do you care that I died? You had never cared about me before, you're the one who told me to jump for fuck's sake. So why do you care?" Bakugu was staring at him, wide-eyed. Shudo was watching too, bento box sitting forgotten beside him. "Of course I care, we've known each other our entire lives. But you never cared before. You burned me every chance you got, you destroyed my things. You never showed any sign of caring, in fact, you reminded me every day that you didn't care. So why start now?" "Because I always cared. I never wanted you to die, I never wanted this. I was trying to stop you from becoming a hero because I knew you'd never make it. Everyone knows you need a quirk to be a hero. You would have died in the entrance exam. You don't know that. Yeah, I do. The robots were huge and had fucking lasers. In the last few minutes, they released a robot that started destroying all the buildings in its path. That doesn't mean I would have died. Maybe I wouldn't have passed, only people with flashy quirks like yours would be able to pass that exam easily, but I could have gotten a few points at the very least. And even if I didn't pass, I could go into general education and get in through the sports festival. You would have even less of a chance in the sports festival. You think if you didn't beat a bunch of robots you could take on the people who did? Yes. Every quirk has a weakness, a breaking point. You should know with how you talk about my analysis. I don't even need to win to get into the hero course, just place within the top 5. Like you would have gotten that far. Fine, I'll prove it to you. I won't go invisible or levitate anything during any of the phases of the sports festival and I'll place in the top 3. Fine. Fine. With that, Bakugo stormed off the rooftop. Izuku could hear his heavy footsteps on the stairs until the door slammed shut, no one supporting it as it closed. Izuku sat down beside Shudo, taking one of his notebooks from his bag and opening it to a blank page. Shudo finished his bento while Izuku wrote. He had it packed away in his bag before Izuku was even close to being finished writing. He decided it would be best not to disturb the other and took out his phone, scrolling through different news and social media sites. When the bell rings, Izuku quickly shoves his notebook and pencil into his bag. He floats both his and Shudo's bag up into the air and follows the boy to the door, going down first as Shudo follows behind. They make it back to the classroom before the next bell, walking in behind Uraraka and Tsu. Izuku floats Shudo's bag over to its hook and hangs his own off its before situating himself in his seat, floating a few inches above it. Once everyone had filed in and sat down in their seats, the bell rang to signal the start of class. All Might burst through the door like he did every day, but this time, instead of being met with smiles and cheers, the class stayed silent. Izuku could tell that it had thrown the man off as he fumbled with his words and almost dropped the remote for the wall containing their costumes. Izuku didn't bother changing into a gym uniform even though his hero costume wasn't done yet. He didn't think it mattered too much. It wasn't like he was representing the school in a public event. Not yet, at least. When the class had filed out into the field, it was obvious that the lesson was going to be much more subdued. There was no fake city. They were standing in the middle of an empty field. Mostly empty, at least. In the middle of the field was a long-running track with 5 places. Throughout the track were different obstacles like hurdles, low-hanging poles, and rock walls. All Might cleared his throat to gain the class attention before explaining what the day's lesson would look like. Today you will be running an obstacle course. Nedzu has made it clear that this should have been one of your first lessons since it would help ensure that costumes fit and function properly. He asked me to let you know that while flashiness will help you in heroics, it is best to focus on practicality until you find what works for you. From the man's tone of voice, Izuku knew that he didn't really believe the last bit of his statement. He thought flashiness was more important than practicality, even if it meant that some of his students were running around in heels with shelves on their backs instead of bags or pockets and had accessories that would get caught on everything decorating their person. At least Hagakure had taken his advice, that he had had Shudo deliver, of getting a costume made instead of just running around without one. He could also see that the light around the costume was fluctuating, meaning that he had taken her advice and was now training with her quirk to affect the things around her. She now had a costume that she could turn invisible at will that would keep her safe from an extent of attacks. Currently, her costume was visible, with a few ripples here and there. It was simple but also flashy, colored with bright pinks and whites with a few patches of cute characters decorating the shoulders, elbows, and the area above the heart of the costume. She had a white belt wrapping around her waist full of pouches and pockets, as well as a hood that she had pulled over her head. Midoriya, how about you be part of the first group, considering you don't have your suit yet? It would be best to get you out of the way. Izuku nodded and walked up to the place of the track furthest from the group. All Might called Shudo, Bakugo, Ida, and Tsu up to join Izuku in the track. Now remember, this isn't a race. Go at your own pace. It was obvious from his facial expression and the way he said it that he was lying. He wanted them to race, wanted to add some excitement and flashiness to the lesson, even if it wasn't part of the lesson plan he had been given. Izuku bent down, his hands in front of his feet and slightly to the side. He didn't glance at those beside him, keeping his attention on the track in front of him. When All Might called go, Izuku took off. He heard the popping of explosions, the crackle of forming ice, and the sound of small engines, but he didn't focus on them. He noted that he couldn't hear Tsu before tuning it all out. He focused on his own footsteps until that was the only thing he could hear. Normally, he also would have focused on his heartbeat, allowing the two sounds to blend together. But he no longer had a heartbeat, so instead he solely focused on the footsteps. The first obstacle he encountered was the hurdles, something he overcame quickly, jumping over each as if it were nothing and touching none of them. There was a small patch of track before the hanging poles, each stationed at a different height. Izuku ducked between some and slid under others. There were one or two that were just low enough for him to jump over. The rock wall came immediately after the poles. He jumped, grabbing onto the nearest handhold and pulling himself up. He slid his feet into the holes made for them or sat them on top of the handholds. When he made it to the top, he dropped down, landing in a roll before popping up and allowing the momentum to carry him. A new obstacle that the wall had obscured came into view. A large pond with pieces of debris floating inside. Izuku jumps onto one of the pieces of debris, jumping from it into the pool. He's never been the best swimmer, but he still knows how. He dives beneath the debris, keeping himself below. He doesn't need to breathe, so he stays underneath until he reaches the end of the pond and pulls himself out onto the track, running in his now sopping wet clothes. The finish line was in his sight now, but there were a few more obstacles set up before it. Izuku knew he could just phase through them if he wanted to, but he wanted to prove that he didn't have to. He wanted to prove that, while his quirk could be useful, he didn't need to use it. He also didn't want All Might to accuse him of cheating despite it being his quirk, but that was a whole other matter. The next obstacle was a row of elevated stools above a pool of mud. Izuku jumps up onto the first stool, careful not to fall in his slippery, soaked shoes. He jumps from one stool to the next, quickening his pace on the last two. He jumps as far as he can from the last stool to the ground, using the momentum to help push him forward. The next obstacle was a tube. Izuku couldn't see where it ended, only where it started. The tube was short enough that Izuku would have to crawl through to the other side. He dove into the entrance of the tube, landing on his hands and knees. A small burst of pain made itself known in the areas that had slammed onto the hard concrete of the tube, but Izuku ignored it. Used to much worse. He crawls through the tube quickly, moving almost like a spider, leaving a trail of water in his wake. When he got to the other side, he tumbled out of the tube, righting himself quickly and taking off across the track. The final obstacle was a large, long line of monkey bars. Izuku jumped up, grabbing the first bar and swinging himself across to the next. He went two at a time, never slowing down or breaking the pattern. When he got to the last bar, he swung himself out before letting go, propelling himself forward through the air. He lands in a roll only a few meters from the finish line. He runs forward, crossing the white line at the end of the track. He finally lets the noise come through and is immediately aware of the sounds of his competitors close behind him. He looks to the side, seeing Tsu on the other side of the tracks. She smiles at him, dripping wet and panting slightly. Izuku returns the smile, watching her turn to their class before turning his attention to the other tracks to see who emerges next. Bakugo and Shudo come out at the same time, both panting with water dripping from their costumes. Izuku can't help but note that the orange and black head decorations that Bakugo had been wearing were missing. Shudo had frost glittering in the sun on his right, and Bakugo was rubbing his wrists and rolling his shoulders in circles. Izuku smiles at Shudo, waiting for him to smile back before looking over to Ida's track. The boy emerged a few seconds later, hunched over with his hands on his knees. He was dripping with water and his hair was plastered to his head. A few pieces of his costume were missing, leaving black areas of fabric where there had been shiny metal. Izuku winced in sympathy for the boy. He obviously hadn't had a very easy experience with the obstacle course. But, on the bright side, he now had at least an idea of some changes he needed to make to his costume. Izuku started walking towards Ida. "Do you want any help?" The boy nodded. "Please." Izuku helped Ida back over to the rest of the class, letting the boy sit down on the ground before leaving him be. He made eye contact with All Might over the heads of his classmates, waiting for the man to say something about his run. He floats up into the air, intangible and unseeable. He flies above the group, smirking when he sees All Might's poorly hidden look of anger at his disappearance. The rest of the class run the course, some taking longer than others, whether it's due to their athleticism or poor costumes. By the end of it, everyone is soaking wet and tired. All Might finally dismisses them to the change rooms with a final remark. "Remember, there are only 2 more school days until the sports festival, as it takes place Monday of next week." There are mumbled replies from the class before they slink off to the change rooms, ready to peel off their soaking suits and dry off. The only one who wasn't soaking wet was Tsu, her hair only being damp. Izuku happily noted that her costume was likely made of some type of hydrophobic material, since she likely planned on working in the water. Izuku waited for Shudo to emerge from the change rooms before walking back to the classroom with him so they could grab their bags before heading over to the gates. Izuku froze when he spotted a woman standing at the gates. He barely registered Shudo walking ahead without him. She was standing off to the side and wringing out her fingers, looking left and right like she was looking for someone. Looking for him. It was Inko. It was his mom. Izuku burst forward, phasing through everyone in his way. As soon as he was out of the crowd, he fell to the ground, using the momentum to carry him forward. He crashed into his mom, wrapping his arms around her in a tight hug. It took her a moment, but once she had gathered her bearings, Inko returned the hug, holding him tight. Tears fell near instantly. Izuku crying into his mother's shoulder and her crying into his. After a few minutes, Izuku pulled away gently, tears still trickling down his face. I'm sorry for not going to see you, I was just so scared and dash. Inko smiled, effectively cutting him off. It's okay. We can talk more about it when we get home. At the mention of returning to the apartment, Izuku looked around in the crowd for Shudo. It didn't take him long to spot the split-haired boy standing a few feet away, looking down at his phone. Inko followed her son's gaze. She immediately noticed the pure worry mixed with panic when he looked at the other boy. Your friend can come too if they want. Izuku nodded. He walked up to Shudo, the boy looking up at him when he got close. Can we go down to my apartment for a little? Shudo nodded, tucking his phone away in his pocket before following Izuku back over to Inko. Inko smiled at him and dipped in a small bow. I'm Izuku's mom, Midoriya Inko. Shudo returned the bow. Todoroki Shudo. Inko smiled and turned around in the direction of the train station. Izuku trailed after her and Shudo walked behind him. When they reached the train station, the three sat side by side on one of the benches. Shudo texted Fuyumi for a while before switching to a news site while Inko and Izuku sat in silence. Occasionally, one would glance at the other as if making sure they were still there. When the train arrived at their stop, Inko stood first, waiting for the other two before making her way to the doors. They walked down to the apartment in the same order they had walked to the train station. Inko in the lead, with Izuku and Shudo following behind. When they stepped inside the apartment, Inko immediately went to the kitchen to start preparing food for the three. Izuku walked down to his bedroom, followed by Shudo. The same All Might sign engraved with his name hung from the door. He eased it open carefully, revealing all the All Might merch lining the room little by little. When the door was completely open, the only thing he could see was All Might's face beaming down on him. Before, that smile would have been a symbol of hope. A sign that he could be a hero even if he didn't have a quirk. Now the smile seemed fake. To him, All Might looked like he was looking down on him. Like he thought he was nothing. Anger rushed through his veins along with waves of disappointment, sadness, and betrayal. He felt the same way he had on that rooftop nearly a year ago. He could feel the same anger at society, those who had hurt him and who had let him be hurt. He felt the same disappointment in himself for being so naive, for holding on to a false sense of hope. He felt the same sadness that had dulled the colors and sounds. And he felt the same betrayal caused by the people he had looked up to the most. But this time he felt more anger. He was angry because even if he now had a quirk, he had to jump off a roof to get it. He was angry because heroes, like Endeavor, were able to get away with whatever they wanted. He was angry because even though he had a quirk now, All Might still didn't think he could be a hero. He felt something land on his shoulder and looked up in surprise. His eyes met Shudo's and he couldn't help but wonder why the boy looked so worried. Are you alright? You spaced out for a while and you were flickering. Only when Shudo mentioned it did Izuku realize that his state had been flickering in and out of solidity. I'm fine, just angry, I guess. At him. Shudo nodded as his eyes roamed the room covered in the face of his heroics teacher. Want some help packing it away? Izuku nodded. Think we can burn some of the cheaper stuff? Shudo nodded and Izuku spun around, poking his head out of the hall to get Inko's attention. Hey Mom? Is it okay if we pack away the All Might merch in my room? Inko turned at the sound of her son's voice, a confused look on her face. But don't you look up to him? Why would you want to pack it up? I can explain later, just please? Finally, Inko nodded, though she still looked confused. Sure dear, there should be some boxes in the hall closet you can use along with some garbage bags if you need them. Izuku smiled. Thanks. He opened the closet door and handed the boxes to Shudo to unfold and put together while he prepared a couple of garbage bags. Once they were in the room, Izuku started throwing figures into different boxes or bags based on their worth while Shudo took down and sorted posters the same way. Eventually, every box and garbage bag was full except for one. Shudo held open the remaining bag while Izuku stripped his bed of the All Might sheets, exchanging them for a regular blue and white set he had found in the closet. Once they were done, they tied off each bag and taped shut each box. They stacked boxes filled with expensive items they could sell in the hall and kept the bags with cheap items they could burn in the bedroom. Looking around his now bare room, imprints of posters burned into the walls, Izuku beamed. Inko poked her head into the hall then, catching the attention of the two boys in the doorway. "Dinner's ready." Shudo and Izuku followed her into the dining room, sitting down at the table in front of plates of katsudon. Spicy just the way Izuku liked it. They ate in silence for a few minutes until Inko asked Izuku to explain why he wanted to pack away the All Might merchandise. Well, you know that I jumped from that building, right? Inko nodded, a sad look in her eyes. Like she knew what was coming. All Might had left me there earlier that day after telling me I couldn't be a hero. Tears traveled down Inko's face, but she stayed silent, waiting to see if Izuku was done talking. "I've also had time to think about him as a hero, and I've realized that he doesn't do the best job a lot of the time. Like, that same day he had saved me from the sludge villain that had attacked Bakugo later, and he didn't call an ambulance or anything even though I had passed out from oxygen deprivation. And he didn't capture the villain properly. He just shoved them in a pop bottle and put them in his back pocket? And he only ever uses 100% of his power when he fights villains, which leads to more civilian injuries and collateral damage than necessary. Like when he fought the sludge villain to save me and caused so much wine that I slammed into a wall and the villain was scattered everywhere. Which, honestly, probably didn't help with the whole unconscious thing dash. That seemed to be Inko's limit, as that was when she leaned across the table and enveloped Izuku in a hug. This seemed to be Izuku's breaking point too, as he returned her hug while crying into her shoulder. While the two Midoriyas hugged, Shudo stayed silent and ate his katsudon, trying his best not to disturb them. He was nearly done with his meal when the two broke apart and returned to theirs. Both Inko and Izuku had tear tracks running down their faces and their eyes were red and puffy, but they didn't look as sad as they had before. They stayed silent for the rest of the dinner. Once everyone was done eating, Shudo offered to do the dishes, saying he wanted the two to continue to spend time together. Though both Inko and Izuku tried to object, it was half-hearted and they were quickly swayed. The two went off to the living room to catch up while Shudo washed dishes, tuning them out while he did, as he didn't think they would want him listening in. Izuku and Shudo both ended up in Izuku's room that evening. Inko had insisted Shudo stay the night, citing the fact that it was much too late for him to walk alone and the trains wouldn't be running soon, so there was no guarantee he would get to the station in time. Izuku had dug around in his closet for a few moments to find the spare futon, and now they were on either end of the dark room, the only source of light the stray rays of moonlight peeking through the curtains. Shudo was laying next to the door, the futon pushed against the wall lengthwise next to the frame. Izuku was lying on his bed, solid, but they both knew he wouldn't be there long. As soon as Shudo fell asleep, Izuku would be up and moving, busying himself any way he could. "You know, the promise you made with Bakugo was incredibly stupid. You have no training." Izuku groaned, rolling onto his back and pressing his hands against his face. "I know. I regretted it as soon as I said it, but there's no taking it back now." Shudo hummed. "I could train with you in quirkless hand-to-hand. We won't have time for more than the basics though." Izuku turned his head so he could look at the other boy. "Really?" Shudo nodded and Izuku beamed, the skin surrounding his eyes crinkling. "Thank you, Shudo. Now get some sleep. It would probably be best to start first thing tomorrow." Shudo raised a brow. "What are we going to do about the fact that we have no gym to train at?" "I can fill out a form to use one of the UA gyms tonight." Shudo nodded and closed his eyes. He fell asleep quickly, his breaths evening out within a few minutes. Izuku waited until he was sure that the other was asleep before slowly sitting up in his bed. He let go, allowing the sheets to fall through his legs and back onto the bed, slightly crinkled and out of place. He floated up and over to his desk, carefully lifting his laptop. He carried it back to the foot of his bed, pressing himself in a nook between the bed and the wall to try and avoid waking Shudo due to the harsh brightness of the screen. When the laptop finally turned on, he lowered the brightness as much as he could while still being able to see the screen before pulling up the UA website. He clicked on the student section and from there found where he could fill out the form. He asked for one of the regular gyms, equipped with side rooms for sparring and quirk training to use after school. He had to fill out his student ID, something he had luckily been given by Nedza the day before and had memorized the numbers of. It didn't take him longer than a couple of minutes to finish filling out the form. He then closed all of his tabs and shut off the laptop. He rose and floated back over to his desk, setting the laptop back down slowly. Looking around his room for something else to do, he became incredibly bored. He wouldn't be able to do anything around the apartment without risking waking someone up, so, Instead, he phased through the window of his room and out into the night. He floated around the city lazily, watching those who were still out at the late hour. He saw one woman walking home with her arms laden with grocery bags, looking this way and that, her eyes never staying in one place for more than a few moments. The thing he saw the most was cars speeding across the roads. He saw more than one run a red light or drive past a stop sign without stopping. This was common though, he saw it often when he took these nightly strolls. Eventually he found a nice park. It wasn't one with a playground but one covered in trees and dense forest, likely home to hundreds of wildlife. Something Izuku had discovered in his first 10 months with his quirk was that animals could sense him, but only if he got too close. Often he could safely watch herds of deer or flocks of birds without scaring them off. He lowered himself into the trees carefully, making his way through the dense foliage until he found a nice clearing. He settled himself just above a branch, hovering in a sitting position with his ankles crossed. He feigned leaning back on his hands and kept his eyes on the clearing a few feet below him, waiting. Izuku saw multiple things that night. A herd of deer, different mice, a flock of crows looking for somewhere to settle, and a couple of different owls. As the sky was beginning to lighten, he rose from his place above the branch back into the sky, making his way back the way he had come so he could get back before either Shudo or Inko woke. When he finally came back to his apartment and phased in through the window of his bedroom, the sun was just finishing its ascension into the sky. He hovered above his bed until he heard his mother stirring in her room. He waited until he heard the sound of her opening her bedroom door and moving around the apartment before allowing himself to fall the last inch onto his bed, causing it to creak slightly at the sudden added weight. The creak of the bed seemed to be all Shudo needed to wake up as he shifted and yawned, sitting up slowly. Izuku waited for Shudo to finish stretching before he spoke. "Good morning." Shudo jumped slightly, startled. His eyes darted over to Izuku, who was trying to hide Snickers under his hand. A small smile tugged at the corners of his lips. "Good morning, Izuku. Did you send in the gym request form last night?" Izuku nodded, sliding off the bed and walking over to the desk. He opened the laptop and typed in the password, checking his email to see if the form was accepted. It had been, meaning that after school that day they had free reign of the equipment and rooms they needed. Izuku nodded to himself as he moved around the room, making sure everything was set for the day. Both his and Shudo's bento boxes had joined the dishes that night, so all they needed was to be filled with food. All their textbooks were waiting in their bags, and luckily the only homework they had was due next week, meaning they could spend most of their time training. Izuku dug around his closet for a moment before remembering that none of his extra UA uniforms were there. Cursing under his breath, he bolted out of his room and down the hall to the bathroom, where both the washing machine and the dryer were kept. Sighing with relief, he found Shudo's uniform in the dryer, ready to be worn again. He brought it back to the boy and went down to the kitchen, intent on helping his mom with the cooking in any way he could. When he got there, he found the table already set and ready, food on each of their plates, Inko sitting patiently in front of hers. "Thanks, Mom," Izuku said as he sat down to eat. Shudo joined them a few moments later, taking his seat calmly and eating at a pace that more matched Inko's slow and steady than Izuku's shove everything in his mouth at once. Once each of them was done, Izuku brought both their bags out to wait by the door. He took out one of their English textbooks and both of their workbooks and brought them over to the coffee table in front of the couch. He and Shudo sat on the floor, trying to get some work done on their English homework before they had to leave. 5 minutes before they had to leave, Izuku packed up their things. He was double-checking their bags when he found that they didn't have their bento boxes. Inko came over with a smile, holding both of them in hand and passing them to Izuku. Both boys thanked her, Izuku a little more profusely than Shudo, and then they left for the train station. The following days before the sports festival all passed in much the same way. Izuku and Shudo would go to school, completing as much work there as they could. After lunch, they would attend heroics lessons, which they participated in begrudgingly, Izuku dealing with Bakugu's glares the entire time. Then after school, the two would head off for one gym or another on UA property. They were never alone, always joined by others of varying years training for the sports festival. Izuku was rapidly improving in his quirkless hand-to-hand. He wasn't past the basics, but he had nearly perfected them, which would hopefully be good enough. He still stumbled sometimes when he was fighting Shudo, or wouldn't use the right amount of force when flipping him, or wouldn't stand quite right and be toppled over. But he was improving and his already honed analysis helped. At the end of the day, the two would return to either the Todoroki estate or the Midoriya apartment. The apartment was much more common, the estate only being stopped at so they could collect their things or visit with Fuyumi. Izuku grew more restless the closer it came to the date of the sports festival. He started leaving the apartment as soon as he could, trying to burn as much nervous energy as possible while he was out. Both of them anxiously awaited the arrival of the sports festival, but both also knew that they had worked hard to prepare and they couldn't do much beyond that. Still, the day of, while 1A was waiting to be called out in their room, Izuku twisted his fingers in his hands and Shudo sat silently on a bench, waiting. Everyone was anxiously waiting for their class to be called out onto the field. Izuku was flitting around the room, invisible, trying to get out some of the last-minute anxious energy. Shudo was sitting on a bench at one end of the room, staring off into space. A few were talking together, trying to fill the silence. Welcome everyone to the first year's sports festival. The sound of President Mick's voice caused all of them to jump. All conversations stopped and their attention turned to the speaker in the top left corner of the room. We're pleased to welcome the certain stars of today's festival, the class who defeated a group of villains on their third day of school, Class 1A. Everyone was immediately up, rushing into the line order Aizawa had drilled them through. Ida leads them out onto the field, waving to those in the stands. A few followed his lead, waving to those watching, while others kept their attention ahead, ignoring the people in the stands. Once they were standing in their assigned area of the field in front of the stage, President Mike started calling out the rest of the classes with much less bravado than he had 1A. As each one emerged from their hall, it was made clear that they already hated Class 1A. Izuku ignored the glares, more than used to them at this point. He could tell though that it made quite a few of his new classmates uncomfortable. Once all the classes were gathered, Midnight rose out of the floor on a moving pillar. She stopped once the pillar was level with the stage, leaving her standing on the platform above the gathered classes. Welcome students. Before we begin the first event, I would like to welcome to the stage your player representative to give the starting pledge. This is the student who placed first in the hero entrance exams, Bakugo Katsuki. There were cheers from the people in the stands, joined by half-hearted applause from the other students. Bakugo grumbled as he climbed the steps to join Midnight up on the stage. He made his way to the microphone set up for him in the middle of the stage at a leisurely pace, taking his time. When he finally made it to the microphone, he leaned in. I'm going to place first and there's nothing you extras can do about it. Immediately the students' attitudes changed. Bakugo was booed off the stage, but he seemed unfazed. He ignored the other students and instead rejoined 1A like nothing was wrong. Izuku sighed inwardly. Bakugo had just made all of them targets, and while it was likely he could win, it was nearly as likely that he would fail. Failing to uphold a pledge like that would make him much less likely to get any internship offers and would lower his respect within the student body, including 1A. What looked like a large slot machine rose up behind Midnight. She raised her arm dramatically and the slots started spinning, their words blurring. And the first event will be. The slots slowed to a stop, obstacle course, clearly written across them. This? Midnight was still turned away from the machine. Izuku nodded to himself, already trying to formulate some sort of plan. The students all moved towards the entrance for the first event, carrying Izuku away in their current. Once everyone was in place in front of the door, Izuku started looking around, trying to graph out some of his competition. Suddenly, Mick's voice boomed from the speakers. Ready folks? Students, on your mark, get ready dash. Midnight interrupted him, sending a quick glare up to his booth. Go. The door to the first event opened and everyone started swarming in, packing together. Izuku hung back for a moment, searching to see what was going on, why everyone was staying so close together. It only took him a moment to figure it out. They were already at the first obstacle. The entrance was narrow, much too narrow for the number of students trying to get through. He could just barely see the exit at the end of the tunnel, but the crowd was nowhere near it, slowed by the confines of the tunnel and those around them pressing in. Izuku hung back, watching as everyone around him funneled into the entrance. Soon he was alone on the field. What's this? A student has stayed behind instead of joining his classmates in the tunnel. What could he be planning? Do you recognize the Kid Eraser? Izuku startled, his attention turning to the announcer's booth. He hadn't known Aizawa was co-announcing the festival. Of course I do, and you should too. He's the new kid in 1A, you've been teaching him for nearly a week now. President Mike laughed. You got me there, Eraser, dash. President Mike took a breath, likely to say something else, but before he could, he was interrupted by the first real piece of action the sports festival had seen. The entire floor of the tunnel had been iced over and most, if not all, of the other competitors were stuck. Izuku took this as his chance, rushing forward into the crowd and weaving through those stuck in the ice. Some had come unstuck, mostly those from 1A, and were moving through the crows in their own ways. Shiro was swinging from tape he had stuck to the walls, and Yoyorozu was weaving through on roller skates. As Izuku was weaving through the crowd, he heard President Mick's announcement. It looks like our first student has made it to the second obstacle, the ambush. 2 of each of the robots from this year's entrance exams are stationed at the end of the tunnel ready to, you guessed it, ambush the students. Izuku exited the tunnel only to find both of the biggest robots, both with massive zeros pointed on their arms, frozen in place. A few of the other robots were frozen as well, but those that weren't rushed forward, trying to attack him. Izuku dodged the robots, leaving them for those behind him to deal with. One of the robots tried to chase him, but he managed to stay ahead of it. As he was nearing the end of the group of robots, he heard creaking sounds behind him. He turned to see the 2 giant robots that had been frozen in place leaning forward, the ice binding them cracking. His eyes widened as he watched them fall, too far away to get there before they did. The ground shook as they landed, causing him to wobble on his feet and others to fall completely. He watched as each robot had a hole torn through its leg as a boy emerged from each of them. One was Kirishima, his quirk activated. The other was a boy that looked to be made of metal. The 2 started talking to each other as they emerged from the craters they had created in the robots. Izuku turned away from them and started running forward to the next obstacle. 2 of our students continue on to the next obstacle, the River of Terror. A mock lake with choppy water filled with debris. Boats are provided, but I'm sure some students will find more creative ways to cross. The next obstacle was as President Mike had described. A large body of water stretching across the field to the next obstacle. The water was choppy and filled with large pieces of debris, though they weren't moving beyond rocking with the waves. Lined up in front of him were 2 different kinds of boats, half had motors and half had oars. Izuku heard the other students coming up behind him and watched as they flocked towards the motor boats. Instead of fighting over a boat with the others, Izuku ran towards the edge of the water and jumped towards the nearest piece of debris. He landed on the edge, taking a moment to gain his balance. He rocked with the debris, constantly shifting his weight so he wouldn't fall into the water. He jumped to the next piece and used the momentum to carry him to the next. As he jumped, he noticed Tsu doing the same beside him. She was a little farther ahead than he was despite having started after him. Izuku finished the obstacle after Tsu but before any of the boats. He looked behind him as he ran, discovering that some of the boats had gotten stuck on pieces of debris, some were stuck behind those boats, and others were having trouble navigating around the clusters of debris, making slow progress. Izuku turned his attention back to what was in front of him when President Mike announced the last obstacle, where Tsu had just arrived. The first student has arrived at the last obstacle, the explosive wire. Leading to the other side of a massive chasm are evenly spaced ropes. Each rope has cement islands stationed at different intervals, making it impossible to switch to a different wire once you've made your decision. The islands have surprises scattered across them, but I'll leave you to figure out what those are. Izuku shook his head as he came to the obstacle. There were 10 different ropes evenly spaced across the chasm. He picked the 6th from the left without stopping or slowing, using his momentum to carry him forward. He shook on the rope, trying not to fall. He quickly came upon his first island just in time as others poured onto the rope behind him. The rope shook violently, sending many spilling into the chasm. Worry not, folks. We have safety nets positioned in the chasm just out of sight and ectoplasm clones ready to collect fallen students. On his island, Izuku could just make out circles laid out in a seemingly random sequence. He was careful not to step on them while trying to keep as much speed as he could. When he made it back onto the rope, he tapped the nearest circle with his toe as he ran. There was a moment's delay before a giant pink explosion erupted, slowing down those on the rope behind him and throwing 1 or 2 students off the platform. He heard other explosions going off around him after his and saw the pink clouds in his periphery. Looks like our students have figured out the surprise. That's right, landmines are hidden in the platforms. They aren't as strong as normal landmines, not by a long shot, but they still pack quite the punch. Any thoughts, Eraser? No. Alright. Izuku continued across the ropes and islands, careful not to set off any landmines as he ran. He did, however, set them off just as he was leaving each platform, tiring to slow down and eliminate as many people as he could. When he came to the end of the rope and the end of the chasm, he picked up speed, running as fast as he could to the finish line. Ahead of him, he saw both Shudo and Bakugu fighting for first. He could hear footsteps behind him and saw people catching up to run beside him in his periphery. And in first place we have Todoroki, Shudo, Bakugu, Katsuki coming in a close second. In third we have Azui Tsuyu, in fourth we have Yoiorozu Yomomo, and in fifth we have Izuku broke across the finish line at that moment, doubling over immediately, hands on his knees. Midoriya Izuku, the newest student to Class 1A. Izuku raised his head to the stands, a blinding smile on his face.